The night penetrated through the loosely drawn curtains, timidly painting the room a deep blue. The heroine felt warmth enveloping her like a light cloud and stretched, waking up in a warm, cozy bed. But today she was not alone in bed and wondered if her friends were still drinking, although it was good that they had not abandoned her anywhere. A man's hand was on her shoulder, and at that moment she heard a pleasant voice asking if the lady was really going to sleep after she had brought him to such a state. The heroine remembered that last night she had been drinking with her friends, and had they really gotten so drunk that they had completely lost their voices. The lady still hadn't opened her eyes, listening intently to the voice as if it was coming from a romantic drama. The stranger pinched her cheek, and she didn't know his name or how she ended up in bed with him. The girl just said, half asleep, that this voice didn't suit him at all, and it was time to stop fooling around. She still hadn't opened her eyes, not understanding why this man was hanging on her every word. The heroine opened her eyes and froze, petrified with amazement. Next to her, on a crumpled sheet, in the semi-darkness of the early morning, lay a man. Not just a man, the embodiment of strength and beauty, as if descended from the canvases of ancient gods. He woke up, stretching softly like a large wild cat, and her gaze, involuntarily lingering on his bare chest, made his cheeks flush with a delicate blush. Panic rose like a tidal wave. She frantically tried to remember the events of the previous night, desperately clinging to scraps of consciousness, but her memory was treacherously silent. His broad shoulders, covered only by a scrap of blanket, his muscular back receding into the shadows. But who is he, and how did he end up here? The dark room, lit by candles, was completely devoid of any reminders of the events of the previous night. There was definitely a half-naked man lying next to the heroine, and she was wearing only a modest nightgown. She didn't even dare ask questions, but this situation gave her bad thoughts. Panic grew. The girl was overcome with fear from the unknown and the sudden surge of feelings. The young man said that last night the girl had attacked him and even undressed him, but the heroine didn't usually get so drunk. It was clear from the stranger's face that he was not at all upset about what had happened, and that everything was completely fine with him. The embarrassed heroine understood that she couldn't just leave it like that, and asked the stranger for forgiveness. He suddenly grabbed her hand, confessing once again that everything was fine and he had no complaints. She looked into his eyes with a confused and frightened look, while the young man told her that he had enjoyed the previous night. Holding her hand on his chest, he also suggested that they continue, because everything that was happening between them was incredible. The heroine was so shocked that she couldn't even say a word, and whispered to him what he was going to continue. He pushed her away from the edge of the bed, afraid that the girl might fall, but now she just wanted him not to come closer. The heroine's heart was pounding wildly, like a bird caught in a cage, and her breath caught in horror and surprise. Hands desperately clung to the blanket, trying to create at least some kind of barrier between them, at least some kind of illusion of protection. She tried to scream, but her throat was constricted by fear, and instead of a scream, only a weak wheeze came out. His gaze, burning right through her, seemed like a death sentence to her. She didn't know what to expect, what he would do. Suddenly he called her Liana and asked if everything unnecessary was okay, because last night she behaved differently. But at the moment when the girl realized that she was not Liana at all, some people burst into the room. The young men's eyes widened in amazement and helplessly darted between the couple in bed and the rest of the company. They called him Your Majesty. At that moment the heroine became scared. Was she really in a foreign country and had clearly overdone it with alcohol yesterday? In short, the girl suddenly woke up in the body of another person, in a completely unfamiliar place. As it turned out, she was the daughter of a viscount, a famous man named Liana Daphne, and the dark-haired youth sleeping next to her in bed was Enoch Philip Dehart, and it seemed he was the emperor of this country. It all sounded like incredible nonsense, because only a madman could have come up with such a scenario. If Liana understood everything correctly, she found herself in a romantic novel that she was reading, with an equally absurd title, Why Was the Young Lady Wandering Through the Rose Garden? The content of the novel was so explicit that she couldn't even finish reading it, but if she had known that she would end up here, she would have read it to the end. Enoch was explaining for the 5th time. The girl suddenly burst into his room and climbed onto his bed, and even undressed, saying that she was hot. The young man certainly wasn't worried about this, but Liana, upon hearing this, was ready to sink through the ground. Last night she climbed into the emperor's bed, and that information alone would be enough to get her beheaded and executed. As far as the emperor knew, Liana loved to drink, But this did not affect her memory in any way, admitting that it was time for the girl to quit drinking. Liana looked in the mirror and saw her own reflection, a completely different lady than she was. With shining blonde hair and clear green eyes, she was the protagonist's cousin, her doppelganger. Liana is a typical villain, appearing at the very beginning of the story only to die tragically. She is incredibly fond of money, thirsty for power, and is also the most inveterate drunkard in the Empire. Liana was almost certain that the heroine had been trying to seduce the Emperor, dreaming all her life of becoming Empress and gaining the power she desired. But she was a completely different person, and Liana's murky past now worried her incredibly. Out of nerves, she even started chewing her hair, but the Emperor said that hair was definitely not food. He even offered to bring some food, since the girl was probably hungry, but she was still frantically ruffling her hair. She looked closely at the young man and realized that this was the same Emperor from the novel, but he did not look like a tyrant at all. According to the novel's plot, Emperor Enoch was pedantic and clean, and he was the only character who never had physical contact with the main character. Anyone who touched him was punished mercilessly, and because of this he was nicknamed the Mad Tyrant. He fired servants for accidentally touching him, and a maid could be fired for simply accidentally brushing against him. The Emperor also exiled people simply for standing at arm's length without observing the rules. And every time the story reached the point of explicit scenes, the character with all the labels categorically refused and looked like an impenetrable wall. At that moment, Liana realized that she had touched him too, and that meant that she too would be exiled or executed on the very first day of entering the novel. Suddenly, Enoch asked the girl if she had forgotten her wish, but Liana could not remember anything like that. He suggested seeing a doctor if it was that serious, and the girl forgot everything after last night. And does she really not remember that she herself suggested touching him last night? Liana knew that the Emperor was not allowed to be touched, but now he was interested in checking something, and he asked the girl to touch her again. The thing is, whenever she touched him, his body felt completely normal. He unbuttoned his shirt, confessing that it was the key to the most important mystery. And last night he believed that this girl was the one who could heal him forever. The Emperor asked the girl to touch his chest, because that was exactly what she wanted, while the heroine did not understand what she had done before she entered her. She saw bold features, a boldly exposed chest, and only black gloves on the Emperor's hands. This was his true taste, and even though Liana was seeing it for the first time today, it all drove her crazy. Whatever happened, the heroine firmly decided that she needed to get out of there immediately, declaring that she was unwell and that she would touch the Emperor another time. She just felt herself break out in a cold sweat. The Emperor noticed that the lady's facial muscles were twitching and she looked unwell. Enoch even suggested calling a famous palace doctor who specializes in treating alcoholism. Liana promised to deal with it herself and decided to leave the room as quickly as possible. She gave the Emperor a convulsive smile, declaring that she was leaving right now and would find her own way out. The heroine decided that as soon as she got out of the Imperial Palace, she needed to find a ship to secretly sail away on. Who knows? When that tyrant Enoch changes his mind and goes wild, he will definitely try to find her again. The heroine ran to the door, but suddenly she stopped abruptly near it, and the Emperor asked what was the matter. Liana realized that she had only one question left, and she had absolutely no answer to it. She asked the Emperor if he happened to know where her house was, and the question sounded even more stupid than her amnesia about the previous night. She managed to get home, and the next morning, Liana felt incredibly exhausted, asking the maid to bring her some water. The maid brought the lady a glass, and she began to drink the contents in one gulp, thanking her for the care. The next second, Liana spat everything out on the bed, although the maid admitted that this is what the mistress always drinks in the morning. There was alcohol in the glass, and the lady was confused about who drinks alcohol in the morning right after waking up. The maid said that Lady Liana does this all the time, and it's true because she was in the body of another person. At least she was glad she got home safe and sound, but now her life had changed dramatically. Perhaps it was worth thanking the Emperor for his help, and he was really scared when Liana said that she had forgotten where her home was. Gratitude was one thing, but avoiding perverts was the key to survival, and she decided to stay away from him. She decided to ask the maid when they said goodbye yesterday if he hadn't said anything else. Someone knocked on the door, but the maid wasn't expecting visitors, and the heroine felt like she was missing something important. Just before she got into the carriage yesterday, she remembered the Emperor whispering something in her ear and asking her to touch him the next time they met. As soon as she remembered this, her eyes widened even more in surprise, and Liana only sighed heavily. She jumped out of bed to stop the maid from opening the door, and she knew perfectly well who was behind it. The voice behind the door said that they had agreed to finish their conversation in the bedroom last night, and these words sounded ambiguous. No matter how you look at it, the Emperor asking her to touch him seems completely unacceptable. Anyone would have misinterpreted these words, and even the maid looked at the door with apprehension when the Emperor shouted, Lena had outdone herself. If this door opens, the girl will have to submit to the tyrant's perverted whims and finally touch his bare chest, which she definitely did not want. Therefore, the heroine had only one way out. She saw an open window and, without thinking, climbed onto it. The heroine hadn't even had her first kiss, and now she was stuck in some crazy love affair, and she didn't want to become the next victim of a perverted despot. Luckily, the window wasn't very high. Liana shouted to the maid. The Emperor was standing outside the door, and she asked her, if he came in, to say that Liana was not here, or better yet, to say that she got drunk, lost consciousness, and died. In front of the lady's maid, Liana jumped straight out the window, and her actions were simply shocking. Just at that moment, the Emperor entered the room and asked the maid if the mistress was not in her bedroom. He went out onto the balcony and began calling loudly for Liana, who was trying not to breathe, standing below in the bushes under the balcony. She hoped that if she just sat here for a while, the Emperor would probably leave, and she was almost caught now. Liana sat down in the bushes of blooming roses and hoped that the Emperor had already descended, and his voice was definitely coming from above. Suddenly, next to the bushes, she saw a child's shoe, and it was definitely a child's little foot. But now the lady was most worried that if the noise continued, the Emperor would notice, and she asked the baby to play somewhere else. The little girl turned around and looked at the girl, while she tried her best to show with gestures that the child would not say anything. As soon as she saw Liana, she immediately became incredibly happy, and Liana just wanted no one to make a sound. She looked at the unfamiliar child with enchanted eyes, not understanding why she was looking at her so intently. And for some reason, at that very moment, the little girl, with incredibly happy eyes, raised her arms up and began to crawl towards Liana. It was as if this child knew this girl very well, and her smile spread even wider. Looking closely at the baby, Liana clearly noticed that this child was her little copy. The heroine couldn't understand what was happening here, but she clearly saw in front of her a little girl who looked like two peas in a pod like her. In the world of this novel, blonde hair and green eyes are quite rare, and only Liana and Elisha possessed this combination. She tried to figure out who the baby was, and maybe it was Liana's younger sister, but she was too young to be her sister. The lady even suggested that perhaps it was her little niece, but for some reason the little one called her mom. She took the child in her arms, trying to understand who she was, and at that moment the Emperor appeared behind her. While Liana was trying to figure out who this little girl was, she completely forgot that she had run away from the Emperor. He stated that he thought the girl was in her room and noticed a small child sitting in her arms. Liana admitted that she didn't remember anything at all and had only met the baby a couple of minutes ago, but her hair color was exactly the same as hers. They were exactly alike, with huge green emerald eyes and blonde hair. The Emperor was stunned by what had happened and asked Liana not to say what he certainly did not expect to hear now. And most of all, he didn't expect that the girl had a small child, although Liana herself didn't know about it either. Liana stated that she was not even married, and where did she have a child? Liana was a minor character, but the heroine clearly remembered that she was free. Unless she was hiding her real child the whole time, who for some reason was sitting in her arms and calling her mom. After these words there was surprise, and just now the little girl actually said the word mom. The young girl timidly turned her attention to the young man standing next to her. She extended her small, chubby fingers and probably wanted to say something to the stranger. While the stunned Emperor did not understand anything, the little girl extended her hand to him and loudly called him Daddy. And at that moment, Liana almost went crazy, and cold drops of sweat ran down her face. But she was not the only one in confusion, and the Emperor standing nearby also looked at Liana with surprised eyes full of embarrassment. The heroes went into the living room to try to figure out the situation, and Liana carefully held the child in her arms. She decided to find out if Enoch was absolutely sure that this was not his child, and unlike her, the young man remembered the previous night perfectly well. It was physically impossible. They had only met yesterday, but now Liana would like to find out why the little girl called her mom and the Emperor Dad. Enoch also did not understand anything, saying that he did not know anything, although he had previously said that he was seeing the baby for the first time. Looking at the little girl, Liana increasingly realized that this child was incredibly similar to her. The Emperor couldn't figure out why Liana had a child at home, and why she was acting as if she didn't know anything. Liana didn't even know where her house was, and now she didn't recognize the little inhabitant of her own mansion at all. The young man was horrified and wondered if she drank so much that she didn't even recognize her own child. It all seemed like some kind of wild nonsense. The Emperor asked her not to worry. The former chancellor suffered from a similar ailment. As soon as he stopped drinking, he felt much better. Liana tried to convince the Emperor that she was not a drunkard at all, and at that moment the butler flew into the room. He confessed in fear that the baby had disappeared, but the maid reported to him that she should be here. He greeted the Emperor, who had arrived unannounced, while Liana could not figure out who the man was. But now there was something more important. It seemed that the butler knew very well about this child, and now it was he who was responsible for caring for him. The Emperor immediately asked if this little girl was Liana's child and who she was. The butler admitted that the Emperor had misunderstood everything. The lady was not even married, and how could she possibly have a child? He said that just recently Liana personally brought a little baby here, and did she really not remember anything about it? Something was clearly happening here, and Liana looked at the butler with stunned eyes and remained to find out what the original Liana had done. The girl was surprised. Hadn't she told the estate resident whose child it was? The butler replied that the lady had never mentioned it and had been sleeping since her arrival, while the servants were terribly worried. He also brought the baby's first toy, and now he felt stupid because he didn't offer to feed the little lady. The lady thoughtfully sent the servant away so that he could go to the kitchen and bring food for the child. Liana wondered if the girl had been brought here with a toy, then she definitely had a parent and guardian. As she looked closely at the little child, she noticed a ribbon sewn onto the toy with the name Ariel. After the butler left, Enoch sighed heavily and stood up from the sofa. The lady stated that now the young man was probably convinced that she was not his mother and that her head was completely in order. She noticed the young man's agitated face, because after this conversation his expression changed. The gentleman asked for forgiveness, realizing that with all his accusations he had gone too far. And in fact, he was simply experiencing something like this for the first time, and he simply didn't know how to behave correctly. Liana immediately noticed the words, something like that, not understanding the meaning of his speech. It turns out the young man had one peculiarity when he touched Liana. Unlike everyone else, his body reacted differently. The girl looked again at the gentleman's bare chest and remembered those very first minutes when she woke up in his bed. And now Enoch looked at the little girl with even greater surprise, because it was unknown who she was. The baby looked at Mr. Enoch and suddenly began to cry sharply in Liana's arms. Her tiny face wrinkled and large tears gushed from her eyes, leaving wet tracks on her cheeks. Liana was surprised, because just now the baby was completely fine, but for some reason now she was crying loudly throughout the palace. The heroine asked the young man to button the top buttons of his shirt so as not to embarrass anyone in the house. Enoch was not used to children's tears and did not know how to react to them. The silence, broken only by sobs, became unbearable. Liana guessed that the little girl seemed to be very scared, much more so than she thought. She grabbed the young man by the hand and asked what they should do, because at this rate the little girl would become even more upset. Enoch had no idea how to calm the little girl down, but his head was full of other thoughts. He understood perfectly well that it was inappropriate to say this now, and he lightly touched the girl's palm. Enoch admitted that he hadn't imagined it at all, and when Liana touched his body, it reacted differently. The girl suddenly covered the young man's mouth with her hand and did not understand that the baby was crying, and Enoch was thinking about this nonsense. Her hand was near the master's neck. The only thing she wanted to do was just quickly tug it. But looking at the young man, she noticed, strangely enough, that he was now smiling charmingly. And most of all, Liana was worried that the gentleman could become angry at any moment, but on the contrary, he was incredibly kind. The baby's crying had finally died down, but an invisible veil of childish sadness still hung in the air. At that moment, the young lady said her second word, "Daddy," with great excitement, looking straight at Enoch. The little girl was incredibly happy that she managed to say something intelligible, and this was the first time something like this had happened to the young man. Liana noticed that the Emperor's face seemed to have some effect on the baby looking at it. She stopped crying and began to laugh. The girl, still sobbing a little, watched his every movement with curiosity. Slowly, very slowly, Enoch covered his eyes with his palms. Enoch paused, then opened his eyes sharply and, widening them for effect, said in a low, slightly hoarse voice, "Boo!" Liana burst into laughter and admitted that, surprisingly, the little girl continued to smile even after this performance. She praised the young man because he did a great job, and the little girl was probably smiling because she liked beautiful people. Just now, Liana herself didn't even notice how she gave the young gentleman a compliment, and admitted that her words were completely objective. Enoch had never felt this way before. No one had ever told him that he was simply beautiful. While they were looking at each other, no one noticed that the little girl reached out and touched the gentleman. No one understood why now, but she suddenly wanted to touch. Liana was scared because the emperor hated it when anyone touched him, even if it was just a child. She immediately began to defend the girl because she did not do it out of malice, and she was just a child who should not be angry with. For some reason, the emperor now looked extremely frightened, and his reaction was rather strange. And at that moment, Liana completely stopped understanding what was happening in this huge room. Suddenly, the young man's hands became covered with frost and began to turn white, emitting an incredible cold. Liana immediately felt, it seemed to her, as if she were standing outside in the snowiest and frostiest weather. She took the master's hands, feeling his icy body, and screamed at him to try to come to his senses. She took his ungloved wrist, for the emperor had said before that his body warmed when she touched it. The girl's fear and panic grew more and more because the emperor remained silent and did not answer. Suddenly, he came to her, holding her silky hair in his hands, and asked her to stay with him a little longer. His body began to slowly warm up, and just one touch of Liana helped to break the magical spell. And now Liana stood in the middle of her house, hugging the emperor, until the magical cold around her stopped dissipating. The young man did not hide it and told about the cursed magic. If he touched any person except Liana, his body would be covered in ice. But Liana was the first one to touch it, and for some reason the curse did not react to her touch. And now, finally, the heroine understood what the young man meant when he spoke about the girl's touch. Now they felt themselves in an awkward situation, each of them thinking something completely different. Enoch said that quite a long time had passed since his body stopped feeling someone else's warmth. He understood that his actions had probably embarrassed the young lady, and he sincerely asked for forgiveness for them. But finally, in his life he found out that it seemed Liana was the only girl who could free him from the curse. The heroine never expected to hear that on the first day of rebirth, she would learn that she would be able to save the emperor from a terrible curse. While the heroes were talking, they completely forgot that there was still a small child in this room. Turning around, they saw the little girl walking on the floor on her own, carrying a heavy toy in her hands. Her joyful, childish cries echoed throughout the room as she held a huge teddy bear in front of her. She probably decided to show the beautiful toy to the emperor, because he definitely hadn't seen it. The little girl's sincere eyes looked straight at the gentleman, and he wondered if she had really decided to give him a toy. It was incredibly sweet. Liana offered the young man to take her and pretend that he was incredibly happy. The first thing he was afraid of was that if he touched the toy, he would probably also be engulfed by the snow curse. Enoch stared at the snowflakes that swirled around his palm in a gentle swirl. But he decided to simply not touch the baby, and carefully took the toy with his gloves, joyfully thanking the girl. He carefully took the teddy bear, and it was the first time in his life that he had felt such joy. The little girl mumbled something incoherently, and he was afraid that this was really how she wanted to apologize to him. Because, judging by her face, the girl was clearly worried about something, but for now she couldn't say anything and only frowned. The emperor continued to look with excitement at the young girl, who was trying with all her might to show him something. Liana also couldn't understand what was happening, but the baby wasn't crying, but really wanted to apologize for something. Perhaps she thought that she had hurt the emperor with her sudden touch. The emperor immediately told the girl that she should not feel guilty, and he simply scared her very much. He even happily declared that he was already feeling much better than before, and that everything was completely fine with him. Liana was delighted when the little girl finally realized that everything was really okay with the master. Just then, a butler appeared in the room, preparing food for the baby and some snacks for the guest. But as soon as he saw a beautiful couple with a child, he immediately thought that he had come in at the wrong time. The butler ran out of the living room, confessing that he would under no circumstances disturb the lady unexpectedly again. While the time was right, Liana decided to ask the emperor one question that was bothering her. How did it happen that for many years the young man suffers from a terrible magical curse and lives a completely different life? He managed to touch the toy calmly, and this curse probably has many features. Enoch decided to tell his story, and that a shard of ice was trapped in his heart. As soon as he touches another person, the ice shard goes out of control and begins to freeze his body. Liana was incredibly curious about how the magical shard ended up right in his heart. Imagine her surprise when the young man confessed that he had placed the fragment in his heart himself. This was even stranger because the young man had condemned himself to such an unhappy life. Once his body started to freeze, nothing could melt it, and so there was nothing left to do but wait for everything to simply die down. He assumed that the girl's family probably possessed the power of fire, and upon touching her, his body began to quickly warm up. Feeling this warmth, the young man was not only able to stop the curse for a short time, but also felt much better, and he supposed that at this rate it was possible that soon he would somehow be able to melt this damned shard of ice. After listening to his opinion, Liana thought about it and admitted that perhaps the Emperor had mixed something up. In this world there were special powers, fire, ice and wind, and other powers that control these elements. Among them, only Enoch had the power of ice, and only the descendants of the House of Daphne, who inherited their blood, could use fire. However, if the heroine's memory serves her correctly, Liana was completely incapable of using the power of fire. She assumed that she probably couldn't have the ability to control the power of fire, and according to the plot of the novel, Elisha displayed the most powerful fire ability in the Empire. It was because of this that Liana was portrayed as a villain who was consumed by an inferiority complex. The Emperor was surprised this couldn't be, and to suppress his power, the girl's abilities must be far beyond the ordinary. Liana smiled and replied that if anyone could have such power, it would definitely be her sister Elisha. At this moment, the operator decided to take a desperate step and began to slowly remove the thick black glove from his hand. He touched the young girl's cheek with his fingertip to check if he had understood everything correctly. Liana pulled his hand away, declaring that the young man had really gone crazy and didn't understand what was going on, wanting to freeze to death. He already had some guesses, and he only quietly asked the lady to look at his hand. The ice that pierced his hand actually began to slowly melt right before the heroine's eyes. The girl was indignant. Couldn't he just tell her about it, and decided to show it in such an unexpected way? Liana was incredibly scared that in a matter of seconds the Emperor would turn into an ice statue. He just gently hugged the lady and confessed that he had just discovered a cure for the damn curse. It was an incredibly unusual day, and Liana went to put the little girl to bed late in the evening. Liana's heart was filled with warm emotions when she saw the sweetly sleeping child, whom, as it turned out, she had brought from somewhere. Today the heroine got another interesting thing that was hanging around her neck. It was a precious pendant with a huge blue stone, and she accepted it as a gift from the Emperor. Liana would never have imagined that in her new life she would become the cure for lifting a terrible curse. And at that moment, she saw how incredibly happy the Emperor was that he would finally be able to get rid of the insidious illness. It happened so suddenly when the Emperor confessed that she was the medicine. With special care and respect, the young man asked the girl to help melt the ice in his heart to get rid of the curse forever. Liana felt that she could not leave this man in trouble because at the very beginning of the novel she found herself with him. Even though she said she wasn't going to be his cure, the Emperor still gave her the pendant and asked her to think about it for a bit. Liana was already having a hard time with her situation, and she felt like it would cause her inconvenience. The young man looked so desperate that she definitely couldn't just ignore him. She was ready to swear that the Emperor from the book she read was an evil tyrant, but for some reason, this young man did not behave like a villain at all. In person, despite his cold appearance, he did not give the impression of being a tyrant, and perhaps the real story has simply not begun yet. However, the gentleman showed his tyrannical nature only towards the middle of the story, when Liana had to disappear from it. Moreover, the heroine had no idea that the Emperor had such a secret when someone touched him. His body became covered with ice inside. In the book, the Lord was simply a hot-tempered emperor, but the reason for this was never mentioned. All that was said was that his mother, the former empress, died because his powers went out of control when he was a child. That's why the Emperor never used his powers again. But for some reason, this now strangely bothered Liana. She sighed, thinking that the young man was incredibly handsome, which was why she couldn't resist him. She still felt as if the young man was sitting next to her, asking her to touch him. This icy youth, who just recently was the most terrible person in the Empire, now for some reason turned out to be incredibly sweet to her. And she was ready to become his medicine, even though they met for the first time today. Now she really didn't imagine it, and the outlines of the gentleman really did appear right in her room. She was scared because the young man looked like a real ghost and suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He said that the necklace he had given her had a communication spell placed on it, which is why he could appear at any moment. The Emperor also said that the pendant contained a teleportation spell in order for Liana to move to it. She needed to press the button on the back of the pendant. Liana held the magical thing in her hands and couldn't believe how much was in this little pendant. Her answer still remained the same, and she did not want to agree to become the Emperor's medicine. Hearing these words, the young man became upset in a split second, admitting that he was very disappointed with her decision. When she came into his room the other day, she promised to do everything if he would let her touch her one more time. Now it seemed to Enoch that the lady had achieved what she wanted and was behaving as if she had never known him. Liana was outraged by his words and asked His Majesty not to speak like that anymore so that people would not misunderstand them. Anyway, there was a banquet to be held tomorrow evening, and the Emperor invited the girl to go with him. Liana turned her head from side to side, refusing, and did not understand why she had to go there. Enoch wanted the lady to go with him, to try to charm her with this face that seemed to please her. And since the lady didn't agree to be his medicine, he assumed he would have to work harder to win her heart. He asked again if the girl really wasn't going to go to the formal event with him tomorrow. The Emperor had not been in vain in persuading Liana to go last night, because soon she agreed anyway, although she definitely had no intention of coming anywhere. With the help of a magic pendant, she immediately moved to the palace, where a grand banquet was taking place. Looking around, the lady saw guests unknown to her and was going to simply stand quietly in the corner. She felt awkward standing around doing nothing, and her throat was dry, so Liana picked up a glass and decided to just lightly wet her lips. She passed by some girls who were heatedly discussing how the Duke was still irresistible. Liana listened to them captivated and didn't even notice how one of the girls spilled an alcoholic drink on her snow-white glove. Her oversight was noticed by one of the ladies present, who said that if a girl was standing there, she should at least have made herself known. She insisted that the lady was behaving indecently, and no one simply noticed that she was walking there. The ladies whispered and laughed at the lady. She was definitely not a noble lady, and she came today, although no one was expecting her. Right before her eyes, the aristocrats were brazenly discussing whether Liana had probably come to establish at least some kind of connection with the Emperor. They didn't even care at all that Liana could hear their conversation perfectly well and how unfriendly they were acting. At that moment, Liana noticed with fright a man in the crowd, a duke who knew exactly who she was. The Duke of Harrington was the father of Elisha, the novel's protagonist, who was her sister. Once his daughter awakened the power of fire, he pushed out Liana's father, who was the heir, and took possession of the duchy. In this world, where a few ability holders held absolute power and were revered, her strength, backed by her fire ability, sometimes wielded more influence than even the Emperor. Of course, Enoch from the imperial family also had the ability, but there were only rumors of its awakening and no one had ever seen him use it. In addition, Elisha was definitely the future empress. The Duke's power had grown even stronger, but now this certainly did not concern the heroine. The girl who was rude to her admitted that she heard from her father that he would soon have to choose a bride for himself. And she asked if the lady knew who the Emperor was interested in. But now Liana was only thinking about how to quickly get something to drink. Liana didn't even listen at all to what the rude woman was saying to her and only looked into her glass. Her friend was indignant, declaring that this place belonged to Lady Elisha, and it was time for Liana to stop bothering her. The new heroine decided not to remain silent any longer, and confidently asked if she had really been bothering her sister all this time. The girl insisted that Elisha was always taking care of her, since they were relatives, and Liana asked if she had really seen this. Liana asked. She was very interested in whether the stranger had really seen it with her own eyes. The girl couldn't prove the truth of her words, and Liana just wanted to know how much of a threat she was in this affair. Raising the glass to her tender lips, the heroine took a sip and assumed that everything is unchanged, both in history and outside of it. The heroine felt someone's gaze on her, and looking into the crowd of guests, she saw a young man who was looking intently straight at her. The expression on his face was rather strange, and there were empty glasses on the table behind the lady. In fact, she didn't even notice how quickly she managed to drink all the wine that was on the table. She immediately left the room to avoid feeling embarrassed and to get away from those stupid empty glasses. The heroine did not understand how, with so many people in the room, this man was able to notice her so quickly. But what was strangest of all was that she always found herself with a glass in her hand when she came to, and even without Liana's memories, her old habits still infused into this body. Liana decided to get some fresh air, but when she approached the window, she heard men's voices. There was definitely someone there. The voice was definitely like the Duke's, and they seemed to be talking about the Emperor. Having listened closely, Liana soon became convinced that the honorable gentlemen were indeed saying something about His Majesty. There was talk of some conflicts, and the Duke asked to keep the Emperor, but for now he could not change his plans. The man standing next to him was surprised that the Duke was really claiming that all they needed to do was contact this man, and everything would soon become clear. Liana clearly heard that other people knew about the Emperor's vulnerability, and this could be connected with the death of the late Empress. The Duke insisted that the boy knew his touch had once killed his mother and could have provoked something in him. And in any case, he was to blame for the Empress's death, but at that moment the Duke suddenly fell silent and turned around. He glanced coldly at the window, and his interlocutor wondered if someone was watching them. The Duke looked around the building carefully, making sure that they were completely alone on the balcony and did not need to worry. He asked to make sure that the Emperor would be busy at the appointed time to carry out his plan, and he also asked, if possible, to find out what weakness the Emperor was so carefully hiding from the public. Liana heard the entire conversation perfectly well, standing near the window, and the lady was very afraid, realizing that she definitely needed to run as quickly as possible. For some reason, her body turned to stone like a mountain, and she could not move either her arm or her leg. She had only a couple of seconds to leave unnoticed, but her body treacherously turned to stone, and the Duke managed to notice the girl and grab her by the throat. The man shouted. He ordered her to sit quietly in the locked house, but for some reason the girl did not obey him. Liana screamed, struggling to breathe, as the Duke held her tightly by the throat and continued to scold her. He threw the girl aside, asking if she had been drinking again and if he could smell the disgusting smell of alcohol. His behavior was simply terrible, his words were rude, and the Duke asked why she could not look after the child properly. Liana didn't understand what was going on here and why he dared to treat her like that, and especially talk about the child. The Duke grabbed his head and asked if the girl had really drunk so much that she didn't even remember what had happened just recently. He continued to get angrier and angrier as he realized that the lady was pretending not to understand who he was talking about. The next second, he confidently stated that he was talking about Elisha's child and that he had ordered her to protect him. And at that moment, I finally found out who the baby belonged to. And in fact, it belonged to Elisha. The novella did not say that Elisha had a child, and it was definitely a baby named Ariel. The Duke warned Liana to make sure that Elisha did not find out about that child. When the time came, he would come to take her away. The man was a cruel man, and he even promised Ariel that if anyone stopped being useful, he would throw the girl out of the palace without a second thought. This concerned not only her, but also her sister, and the Duke did not care at all about either of them. For the first time in the novel, the heroine encountered such a cruel person, and she could not even believe that he really was her relative. And he just grabbed her by the throat with his own hands and also cursed and threatened. But it was much more important now to get the necessary information, and she heard everything she needed. Judging by the conversation she overheard, the Duke was definitely up to something. After that, she definitely couldn't allow the Emperor to get involved with this treacherous man. And if the Duke manages to learn about the Emperor's curse, he will take advantage of his weak point. Liana entered the hall again and immediately caught the eye of the Emperor and his assistant. The young man was very surprised when he saw the strange expression on the lady's face, as if something had happened to her. Everything was almost perfect, and at least the girl managed to attract the gentleman's attention to herself. It so happened that she loudly shouted his name right across the entire hall, which already attracted the attention of many bones. One aristocrat noticed that the lady was again trying to pull something off with His Majesty, demanding his close attention. In fact, Liana was trying to prevent the Emperor from losing control at the banquet, but now she felt very uncomfortable among all the eyes. The matter was very important, and Liana approached the Emperor, asking if she could hold his hand for a moment. This proposal was too strange, because just recently she herself had refused. Enoch certainly didn't expect that the girl would approach him right at the banquet and offer to touch him. Before the Emperor could understand anything, Liana had already deftly removed the glove from his hand and asked him to wait. And now, right in front of all the aristocrats, Liana carefully held the Emperor's hand. The guests took close notice of this and assumed that the girl was acting as if she had completely gone crazy. But His Majesty really does hold her hand, although everyone knew that he was not to be touched. Holding his hand, Liana said she overheard a conversation between the Duke and some man on the balcony, and it was very urgent. The Emperor sighed. His life had been too quiet lately, and this was probably the calm before the storm. Liana suggested that they hold hands one way or another, so that the Emperor would not lose control of his curse. The brave lady even offered to hold her tighter and hide behind her back if necessary. The young man asked what would happen if someone else tried to harm the girl, and she was unable to resist. And he couldn't even believe that this fragile lady was offering him, a tall young man, to hide behind her back. The lady warned that now was not the time to hesitate and that a decision needed to be made as soon as possible. She even promised to make sure that no one dared to touch the gentleman and to watch it closely. The heroine offered to hurry to the Duke and was even ready to accompany the Emperor so that nothing happened to him. For the first time, Enoch felt that someone cared about him, and that such care came from the heart. He asked if the lady could really protect him because it seemed too absurd. Lyanna warned that the Emperor should under no circumstances interfere in conflicts because he would not be able to contain his curse. They approached Duke Harrington, who bowed to the Emperor and admitted that it was an honor for him to be present at the banquet. But his next question was unexpected, and he wanted to know why the Emperor was next to the Viscountess. Lyanna couldn't even breathe and felt intense fear at the sight of this man. Enoch seemed to sense this and offered to speak with the Duke alone and invited the girl to enjoy the banquet. He whispered that he would definitely return soon, and Lyanna would be able to continue to protect him. Seeing their strange whisper, the Duke frowned and wondered what was going on between these two. The heroine decided to spend her free time outside next to a huge, majestic fountain. She was upset that she had promised to protect the Emperor, but she herself trembled in front of the Duke, and he certainly noticed it. And most of all, Lyanna could not understand why her body did not obey her in the presence of the Duke. The lady really wanted the Emperor not to have a conflict with the Duke, and they would simply discuss everything calmly. As soon as she thought about it, Enoch appeared right before her eyes against the night sky. The heroine had no intention of saying that she was overwhelmed by the attention after the situation was resolved. The Emperor said that the Duke would take part in a conflict with another state, and he himself told him about it. He understood that Lyanna was afraid that the young man might lose control of the curse, and he did not expect that she would help him so much. In fact, for some reason, Lyanna did not care about the fate and the Emperor's curse. After all these events, she changed her mind and agreed to become the cure to remove the curse. After her words, Enoch was surprised, and even thought that the girl had probably drunk too much alcohol. Lyanna took just a sip, and admitted that she was definitely not drunk and understood everything. After this sip, another glass of wine followed, and the girl also told about it. The Emperor asked if Lyanna had forgotten what the doctor had recently told her about alcohol. The girl insisted that she had only drunk a little, and the Emperor invited her to go to the carriage, promising to join her soon. As soon as Lyanna leaned her hand on the bench, she suddenly wanted to lie down, and the Emperor saw her in an extremely strange state. Enoch offered to send his knight to escort the lady to the carriage, which was already comfortably seated on a bench. The heroine clearly felt under her feet that for some reason the road was constantly winding, and her legs completely refused to obey. But up until that moment she was sure it was all pretty weird, and she had only drunk a little alcohol. And as soon as she tried to take a step, she immediately fell face down on the ground near the fountain. Now she definitely looked like a real alcoholic, not to mention the fact that the lady was just dying of embarrassment right now. After the fall, she hit her knee hard, blood appeared on her leg, and it was completely unpleasant to appear before the Emperor in such a state. Sitting near the bush, she continued to blame everything on the treacherous glasses of alcohol, because if it weren't for them, nothing like this would have happened. While Lyanna continued to be angry, she suddenly heard a voice next to her, and it was very familiar to her. It was the Duke, scolding his assistant for not being able to handle even a trifle properly. The assistant was terribly sorry, stating that the impudent Viscountess had intervened at the most critical moment. The Duke warned that they must speed up the marriage alliance between His Majesty and Elisha, and this was part of his plan. The assistant promised that even in the presence of the Duke, they would guarantee that everything would go smoothly. The heroine was stunned. For some reason, she heard the unpleasant conversation again, having learned how cruel the main character's father was. He should have kept his distance from the man until they collided again, but right behind the bushes, the Duke was standing nearby again. Lyanna tried to behave quietly, but the alcohol took over her physical state, and the lady quietly touched the bushes. The Duke saw her and immediately shouted, asking if the girl had taken up the habit of prowling, calling her a dirty rat. Lyanna assured that she had not eavesdropped under any circumstances, and only prayed that the night would come soon. Looking, she tried to smile and said that she just felt dizzy and fell next to the bushes. The angry man didn't want to hear anything more. He swung his hand and hit the girl on the cheek with all his strength. A crimson mark appeared on Lyanna's cheek, contrasting with the pallor of her marbled skin. The lady flinched, reeling from such sudden rudeness, his face distorted in a grimace of uncontrollable anger, his eyes flashing lightning. The assistant could not stand up for the lady, given his low status, and the Duke did not want the lady to snitch to the Emperor again. Liana was silent, her eyes downcast. She felt hurt, offended, and scared. She knew that any words she said now would only add fuel to the fire. The Duke was afraid that she might tarnish his reputation and threatened her to keep quiet and not create trouble again. Forgetting about propriety and the assistant standing nearby, the Duke poured out his anger on the unfortunate girl. And he was sure that she had definitely already attracted the attention of the Emperor and had some kind of connection with him. The Duke crouched before Liana, threateningly asking if she really thought that getting closer to the Emperor would change anything. He certainly wasn't going to give her even a drop of freedom, but Liana listened attentively to these words and didn't understand what they were talking about. In the original story, Liana became close to the Emperor not for the sake of her Empress status, but for a completely different reason. Because she wanted to live, the heroine even suggested that perhaps Liana had some kind of illness, but she looked quite healthy. And she is still conscious even after such a strong blow that the Duke just dealt her. All this time, the girl remained silent, and the Duke began to get even more angry because she ignored and did not respond to his words. Liana closed her eyes and became afraid this man could very well hit her again, despite her wishes. As soon as he swung his hand over her head, a cold male voice was heard behind him. The Emperor saw the Duke swing at Liana and, disregarding court etiquette, quickly approached him. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were filled with undisguised discontent, and the Duke held his breath, anticipating anger. The Emperor calmly asked the Duke what he had allowed himself to do there, and he had to answer his question. The Duke grabbed Liana by the hand and began to lie, as if it was the girl who had caused the commotion at the banquet. And he, supposedly being the elder of the family, only scolded her a little, but the Emperor knew that this did not make the Duke of House Harrington the head of House Daphne. The Emperor threatened the Duke, assuring him that there was something in that fragile body that he should not raise his hand to. He began to justify himself by saying that he was simply scolding the girl and that these injuries were sustained when she fell on her own. He was not at all to blame if any bruises appeared on her body, although the mark from the slap was visible on the girl's face. Standing before the Emperor, the Duke continued to brazenly lie, and probably thought that after he beat the girl, she would just let him go so easily. The girl had already firmly decided that the Duke would be punished to the fullest extent because he dared to hit her. Enoch immediately noticed the lady's bleeding lips. She confessed that the Duke had indeed hit her. He continued to insist that Liana was brazenly deceiving His Majesty, trying to remain unpunished in this situation. Liana answered confidently. It was the Duke who hit her in the face, so hard that almost all her teeth fell out. The Emperor warned that the Duke constantly spoke of his deep affection for his niece, but his way of showing affection seemed rather crude. The Duke tried to explain something, but the Emperor knew that he was hiding behind patronage over his niece, and he gained control not only over the fortune of the Daphne family, but over the entire house. In the novel, the Duke was described as an arrogant character. He controlled everything and tried to get his hands on the girl's fortune. But here, in A New Life, just one glance from the Duke paralyzed the girl to the point of fear and trembling throughout her body. And on top of that, this villain took away all the fortune of the innocent girl, taking possession of her riches. It wasn't that Liana had read the novella very carefully, but neither the Emperor nor the real heroine were like the ones she remembered. The Emperor stated that if this is what the Duke calls protection, perhaps his powers should be revoked as soon as possible. Hearing this, the man became incredibly frightened, assuring that all these years he had been protecting Daphne's house for about 20 years. And now he couldn't believe how the Emperor could suddenly strip him of his title when he had only taught this girl a lesson. Even if it was a matter of discipline, the Emperor noticed, the Duke became incredibly angry. He stated that the Duke's guardianship of Daphne's house was to continue only until the heiress came of age. The Emperor warned the Duke that he should have returned everything long ago, but he had deliberately put it off for years. Enoch came closer to the villain and whispered in his ear that he was continuing to hunt for his niece's fortune. The Duke tried to prove that his fortune was much greater, and that he simply continued to manage the house because Liana allegedly asked him to do so. The Emperor turned to the girl to hear her true opinion and asked if it was true. The heroine didn't know what the real Liana was like, but now she was a completely different person, and she definitely didn't think so. It was impossible to disobey the emperor's word, and His Majesty declared that from that day on, the full power of the House of Daphne should be returned to its rightful heir. The Duke never expected that the emperor would stand up for his niece, deciding to properly deal with the violence. His Majesty asked the lady if she would like to choose any special punishment for the Duke. The Duke had mentioned before that there was still time before his departure, but Lyanna needed him to disappear somewhere now. Therefore, she was going to ask the emperor to send the Duke and his assistant somewhere far away. The girl smiled and asked to send them to the battlefield right today, so that they would disappear without a trace. The emperor hurried to treat Lyanna's broken knee, and the girl's bruise hurt very badly. The young man tried to do everything carefully and asked if she really thought that such a punishment was appropriate for the Duke. She just wanted the Duke to go to the battlefield right now, and the emperor still had no intention of following procedure. He warned that if the Duke died, it would create problems, but the lady should not worry about that now. When he said these words, the emperor's face remained unperturbed. The young man admitted that he hadn't really wanted to eavesdrop or pry into Lyanna's affairs, but he had been there at the perfect moment. The emperor spoke about the Duke's words and said that if the girl got closer to him, she would finally be able to breathe freely. The heroine understood that this question had been bothering the emperor all this time, and he just wanted her to be happy. To be honest, she admitted that she herself did not know what to do next, and all this time the Duke had treated her rudely. Every time she saw the Duke, her body would freeze. She couldn't even speak normally, and it seemed like the heroine had a terrible relationship with him. Lyanna admitted that, as the emperor knew, there were many gaps in her memory, so she could not even give a clear answer to his question. But she asked not to be misunderstood, and her forgetfulness had nothing to do with alcohol. It was obvious that the young man was clearly worried about her and just wanted her to stay by his side. Lyanna asked if she could really buy medicine for the emperor in exchange, and after that her life would definitely change. Even the emperor didn't know how the treatment would go. He could only guess that Lyanna's fiery power was capable of melting the splinter in his heart. In this state of affairs, the young man feared that his mind and heart would eventually become completely numb. But even while saying these words, he still smiled and believed that he could start living a normal, happy life. The heroine still couldn't understand why he chose her, and if he needed the power of fire, Elisha was better suited. The emperor confessed that he had previously tried to establish contact with the lady, but this had still provoked the murder. Therefore, he was sure that only Lyanna could break the terrible centuries-old curse, and she was the only girl whose hand he could hold, the only one from whom he felt warmth. For many years, the emperor tried to break the curse, but now he was completely sure that he only needed Lyanna. After listening to his story, the heroine finally agreed to help the emperor, because she was the key to the solution. She didn't know if she could be of any use, but she decided to try to be his medicine. Hearing the consent, Enoch was incredibly happy and thanked the lady, although she still could not believe in her powers. The young man warned that the girl could freely use his help whenever she needed it, but Lyanna had no intention of using the emperor, and she did so without expecting anything in return. The heroine didn't even know why she agreed, but even after the refusal she continued to think about it and her true feelings burst out. If anything, with the help of the emperor, she found out whose child Ariel was, and now she felt some peace. She told the emperor that the baby was Elisha's child, but it seemed she didn't even know about it. The emperor managed to grasp her thought. He stroked the lady's head and asked her to rest well, and promised to talk about the rest tomorrow. Lyanna still had a lot to tell, but she felt that she was too tired and just wanted to sleep. The thought of the girl's role as a medicine haunted her, and she needed to express her gratitude for saving her. But while Lyanna was thinking about all this, she didn't even notice how she closed her eyes and instantly fell asleep. She fell asleep sitting right on the chair, and the emperor stood next to her and wondered if this was really happening to him. Even though Lyanna was the only one who could melt the ice in his heart, he himself didn't understand why he did it. The emperor was furious with the Duke, whom he usually ignored, but nevertheless now he simply had to put the lady to bed. He carefully picked her up to lay her on the bed and felt how weightless and fragile Lyanna was, and he certainly couldn't understand how it was possible to hit such an innocent, fragile creature. The young man laid the girl on the bed on a soft pillow and noticed that the capillaries on her cheek had even burst from the strong blow. Enoch knew he needed to apply ice to her cheek before her face swelled any further. The emperor was worried he needed to leave quietly before the lady woke up, so as not to disturb her peace. But at that moment he saw a little child, Ariel, walking across the floor, who at that time should have been in his crib. The little girl stood and blinked her eyes, looking at the emperor, and muttered something in baby language. The emperor was sure that just a couple of days ago Ariel could hardly speak in front of him, but now she was trying to make some incomprehensible sounds. The young man laughed, realizing that the little girl was simply inviting him to play, but he already had to leave. He carefully laid the child down next to Liana, lay down next to her himself, and this scene was incredibly strange. Enoch had decided to stay behind because of Ariel, to make sure the child had fallen asleep, but now he himself could not fall asleep. Liana was fast asleep, and the young man suddenly felt how the girl turned over in her sleep and gently hugged him around the waist. He heard his heart pounding loudly and felt like he had never been so confused. For some reason, the damned heart, which usually never worried, suddenly began to beat wildly, and was it really the ice that melted because he touched Liana? The young man's heart was beating so hard that he couldn't even believe what would happen when it completely thawed. Perhaps the emperor's heart should melt just enough to avoid creating unnecessary noise. Lying in the same bed with Liana and the baby, the young man tossed and turned and felt that he could not fall asleep. From then on, the emperor never shared his bed with anyone, and for many years he lived and slept in complete solitude. Looking at the sleeping girl, he saw that the swelling on her cheek had worsened in just an instant, and Liana's face had begun to swell greatly. He was afraid to move so as not to wake Liana, and the servant's bell was out of reach. It was necessary to cool the bruise before the swelling increased, and the emperor simply decided to use the ice curse for good. When he was 7 years old, the emperor's power killed his mother, and since then he has been too afraid to use ice magic again. And now, after so many years, Enoch decided to use a terrible curse to remove the swelling from that sweet face. Perhaps the elders would be furious if they found out about this. The emperor took off his glove and applied his hand to the bruise, fearing that the girl might become as cold as his mother. He carefully controlled his powers, and Liana, in her sleep, gently took his hand and muttered something indistinctly. In her sleep, the girl smiled, feeling a pleasant coolness that touched the painful bruise. For the first time in his life, the emperor's curse had benefited someone, and strangely enough, he could control it around this girl. For some reason, he smiled as he looked at the sleeping Liana, and the smile made her face happy. Holding his hand on her cheek, the emperor suddenly felt himself smiling sweetly in response. And if anyone saw him now, they would definitely decide that the cold-blooded emperor had gone mad. Little Ariel slept soundly on the bed, and soon the emperor fell fast asleep as well. She suddenly woke up sharply and felt refreshed, but she knew it was too much for just 5 minutes of napping. She opened her eyes and realized that the room was still dark, and it must not have been morning yet. Liana decided to sleep a little longer, and when she buried her face in the pillow, she felt that for some reason it was too hard. But as soon as she opened her eyes even more, she realized that she had buried her face not in the pillow at all, but in the emperor's shoulder. Enoch also woke up and asked the girl if she had slept well while he was guarding her sleep. Smiling, he asked the lady to get up from his hand because it was numb, and Liana could not understand why the emperor was lying in her bed again. She jumped away from the young man abruptly and asked what he was doing here, and she definitely did not remember how she fell asleep yesterday. Enoch assumed that the lady was probably making something up again, but he hastened to warn that this was not at all the case. What she was most afraid of was that she didn't remember anything again, and perhaps the same situation had happened. Liana was afraid that it was because of the alcoholic drinks that she attacked the emperor again, remembering the previous incident. The emperor said that this time the girl did nothing and only slept peacefully and did not even touch him. Liana grabbed a mirror to examine her bruise, but was surprised that her face was completely normal. Just last night her cheek was incredibly swollen, but now she couldn't see any trace of the severe bruise. She continued to look at the mirror in surprise, not understanding how this could have happened. The emperor touched her face, asking if she felt any pain, but the bruise had disappeared without a trace. Enoch was incredibly glad that he was able to help her in some way, using a terrible curse that always brought death and disappointment. The heroine sincerely thanked him and admitted that if it weren't for him, the situation would have turned out disastrous. However, the emperor warned that her lips and broken capillaries required proper treatment. Liana saw that for some reason this young man was showing her care and support, despite the fact that they had only known each other for a short time. At that moment, a child's voice was heard, and Liana was surprised that Ariel had really spent the night in the same bed with them. She was sure that the butler had put the baby to bed in her room, but for some reason the baby came to her bed on her own in the evening. Ariel was in a great mood and was already saying some words, something like Mom, Dad, and love. The heroine was incredibly happy that the little girl liked it here, but perhaps soon she would have to forbid calling her mom. because she understood perfectly well that this was not her child at all, but her sister Elisha's child. The emperor looked at the girl in surprise, and Liana noticed his wary gaze. The young man asked the heroine if it seemed to her that the baby had become much larger, as if she were growing by leaps and bounds. However, it was interesting that Ariel could already pronounce some words, and for some reason she still called Liana Mom. Perhaps the name Liana was too difficult for the girl, and that's why she called the closest person Mom. Liana decided to make sure of this, and asked Ariel to try to repeat some words after her. She said her name syllable by syllable while the baby tried to pronounce it, but she couldn't do it at all. The emperor suspected that something was clearly wrong here, but Liana could not at all suspect someone so sweet. But one thing was clear: this child now needed protection and care, because his mother was nowhere near her. Ariel looked away from the emperor and began to mutter something angrily, looking at the bedside table. The heroes heard a strange noise, as if something was vibrating somewhere, and it was definitely the emperor's pendant. The young man picked up the family jewel and realized that someone was calling him on an urgent matter. One of the emperor's assistants called him via magical communication and wanted to find out where His Highness had been the previous night. He managed to notice that the young man was in the Viscountess's room and was surprised that he had really spent the night with her. The emperor declared that it did not matter now and asked why there was such urgency. Ignoring his assistant, Enoch asked if Liana was hungry, and yesterday she hadn't even been able to properly eat dinner. The assistant asked the emperor if it was true that yesterday he himself had raised his hand against Duke Harrington. Most likely His Majesty sent the Duke away, but he had never been interested in his affairs before. Therefore, the assistant was surprised why the emperor suddenly turned his attention to the Duke's misdeeds. He asked His Majesty to return to the palace immediately and take the young lady with him to sort out some matters. As luck would have it, the heroes had to linger for a while longer, and the emperor urgently needed to change his clothes, because little Ariel spilled milk on His Majesty right before leaving. Liana was worried that she was causing too much inconvenience, but he assured her that it had nothing to do with her, and it didn't cause any particular trouble. And it's true that the little girl didn't spill the milk on purpose, she was just being a little child. While the emperor was changing, Ariel sat next to Liana, and suddenly a frowning expression appeared on her face. The baby began to crawl around Liana while the lady tried to calm her down, assuring her that it could be dangerous. Ariel started to behave strangely. She crawled with all her might, and the emperor did not understand what was going on. Perhaps the girl was bored and was trying to cheer herself up in this way, and the heroine, with a happy smile, asked the little girl to calm down a little. What she was most worried about was that someone would step on Ariel's hand, but the danger lay elsewhere. Liana accidentally pushed the changing screen, which immediately flew towards the emperor. Liana couldn't stay on her feet, and the next second she was supposed to collapse right along with this screen. The screen fell anyway, and the lady, along with it, fell right onto the emperor, who was changing clothes at the time. The young man hadn't even had time to button his shirt yet, and Liana was right on top of him, touching his bare torso with her hands. Every time, for some reason, the heroine caused inconvenience to the young man, and she worried whether everything was okay with him. She was afraid that she might inadvertently harm the emperor, and this after she had promised to be his medicine. The lady tried to get up as quickly as possible, fearing that she would now definitely be executed or exiled from the city. Still, Liana had already noted that the emperor really did have a beautiful body, of course. He was a character from an adult novel. At that moment, the girl felt like she had gone completely crazy, and stupid thoughts began to visit her. Liana hurried to button his shirt and declared that it was a complete disgrace, because the young man was lying there with his shirt unbuttoned. Liana began to justify herself, warning that she couldn't undress like that in front of everyone and allow herself to be touched, and that this was definitely not acceptable. In fact, the heroine simply felt so embarrassed that she was ready to sink into the ground. The emperor laughed, noticing that for some reason the girl could not stop looking at his bare chest. The heroine's cheeks became so red, like ripe cherries, and she couldn't even breathe from the stress. Her hand was still touching the emperor's body, and at that moment, he noticed something strange. Her fingers gently touched his body. The heroine suddenly asked if the emperor could open his shirt a little more. The young man didn't understand anything, because just now she had ordered him to button it up, but now Liana was insisting that she needed to take a good look at something. The symbol above his heart seemed to fade every time the girl touched it. Liana asked the emperor to take a look when he touched the symbols. They glowed, but disappeared as soon as she removed her hand. She tried to understand how the young man's body reacted to her touch, but she had been holding her hand on his chest for too long. It seemed that when she touched it, the power of the curse weakened, and therefore the symbol became pale. It was simply incredible, and an excited Liana asked if she could touch him again. In reality, she just wanted to help him and look at the disappearing ice symbol one more time to make sure that she could actually do something. For some reason, Enoch was in no hurry to get up and only modestly covered her naked body with a shirt. Liana began to worry that she might have hit the young man and asked if she should really help him up. The embarrassed emperor was still sitting on the floor and for some reason did not get up, but he was definitely not in pain. The heroine became even more frightened, thinking that perhaps he had assumed that she was harassing him. And at the most inopportune moment, the doors of the room swung open and the butler entered with a fair-haired lady who asked him to let go of her hand. The heroes saw a strange situation. The emperor was sitting in the room with his shirt unbuttoned, and next to him was Lady Liana. It was her sister Elisha, who certainly did not expect to see her sister sitting with the emperor. Elisha indignantly asked what they had done here, while none of the heroes could explain what was happening. Now Liana will probably have to tell her sister something so that she doesn't make up all sorts of things. All the heroes gathered at the table, sipping delicious aromatic tea, but so far none of them had said a word. Little Ariel was next to Liana the whole time, and she realized that it was worth starting with an explanation about Ariel. The Duke insisted that she not tell her sister about this, but it would be right to inform her that her child was here. It's also weird that Ariel calls her mom, right in front of her real mother. For some reason, her sister suddenly burst into tears, asking if Liana had really achieved her goal. The heroine didn't understand what was happening or why her sister started the conversation with this, but she had always said before that she wanted to be with the emperor. It turns out that Liana kept repeating this over and over again, and now her sister found her in the room with His Highness. She tried to explain that Elisha had misunderstood everything and that she and His Majesty had simply fallen by accident. But for some reason, her sister didn't want to listen to her. She was nervous and shouting, claiming that she knew everything without any explanation. Elisha certainly couldn't have known anything, but suddenly she declared that she had heard everything with her own ears. Father had been stripped of all authority over the Daphne estate, and his sister was already well aware of this information. Technically, nothing was taken from the Duke, but rather what was already rightfully Liana's property was returned. Elisha was angry that her sister had sent her elderly father to the battlefield without even a sword, knowing that he would not survive. Hearing her words, she was incredibly surprised, because she called the Duke elderly, the very one she knew. She argued that her father was not at all weak and was still full of strength, and that he had simply lost all his titles. Liana realized that her sister was not going to listen to her and was proving the opposite, trying to persuade her to do something. It seems like the girl is constantly being put in a bad light today, even though she did absolutely nothing of the sort. Gritting her teeth, Elisha menacingly asserted that it was Liana's fault that her father was sent to the battlefield. The girl continued to be indignant, as if Liana was so upset that her father became a duke instead of her father. During all this time, Liana never even thought about it once, while her sister was sure that she was doing all this on purpose. The sister's hands were shaking. She was very angry that Liana did all this for revenge, and had even recently been in His Majesty's chambers. Elisha stated that her sister had deliberately gotten close to the emperor, and she didn't even care at all that the emperor was sitting next to her. Liana decided to clarify, and asked if her sister really thought she had planned all of this a long time ago. Enoch decided to intervene in their conversation, and he suggested that if his sister didn't listen to Liana, she would at least listen to him. He asked if he was like a puppet emperor who would allow himself to be controlled for a petty revenge. Elisha realized she had spoken too strongly and admitted that she had not meant it at all. The emperor sternly declared that the girl had inherited from her father the ability to invent all sorts of nonsense and had absolutely no desire to understand the essence of the matter. He managed to at least somewhat stop Elisha's loud statements, accusing her sister of things she did not do. The young man noticed that the girl was feeling unwell and asked if she was really that unwell. He even offered to bring her some warm water with honey, and probably after yesterday's alcohol she felt sick. Liana appreciated the emperor's concern, but she understood that now he had to pay attention to her sister in order to sort out something important. Suddenly Elisha stood up and declared that she was the emperor's bride, but he did not remember ever having a bride. The lady told about the prophecy, assuring that she and the emperor were destined for each other from birth. She spoke again of this absurd story, and many believed that the Daphne family would become the emperor's salvation. The young man smiled, asking if Daphne's family was definitely not limited to Elisha, and that she had a sister. Perhaps the prophecy wasn't complete nonsense after all, and Lady Elisha certainly wouldn't be his salvation. After his words, the girl began to get even angrier, because all this time she was sure that one day she would become empress. She called her sister stupid, insisting that she didn't even have any abilities, and her father and even the late emperor said the opposite, that it was Elisha who was destined for the emperor, and that she alone should become his only wife. Enoch asked the girl if she thought her father simply wanted a puppet emperor that he could control. Despite everything, Elisha still believed that the emperor was obliged to marry only her. The lady burst into tears and did not want anyone to see her tears, so she got ready to leave and went to the door. The emperor asked her before she left if Elisha really wanted to marry him, even though he had no idea about it. Carefully opening the door, the lady admitted with tears in her eyes that she had certainly believed in such an outcome all her life. It was the first time that such a frank dialogue took place between the sisters, and Liana had no idea how Elisha really felt about her. She felt that she absolutely had to go and get her sister to talk to her privately about what had happened. Liana went out onto the balcony and asked if Elisha wanted to talk to her so that no doubts would remain in her mind. She asked for it respectfully, but her sister angrily declared what right Liana had to talk to her. The heroine understood that her sister didn't like her, but now she insisted that her father had started all this and that she should look at her bruise. There were small scratches on the girl's cheek, and she told Elisha that her father, the Duke, had done this yesterday. Elisha couldn't believe her sister claimed that her father had hit her and behaved inappropriately, but her sister didn't have an ounce of sympathy, and she only replied that since this happened, Liana deserved it. The lady did not come here to argue, and she simply wanted to have a frank talk with her sister. And there will be no other moment suitable to finally find out whether Elisha really does have a small child. Sister asked Liana to watch her language and thought she was trying to impugn her name with baseless rumors. The heroine confidently declared that Ariel, the little girl who was next to her today, was Elisha's daughter. After her words, the girl turned away abruptly, and Liana explained once again that the little baby was her daughter. For some reason, Elisha didn't even want to hear anything about it and asked menacingly what business she had with the little girl. She didn't care at all whether she was dead or alive, and she admitted that she didn't want to talk about it. For some reason, the girl was acting strangely. She was crying and very nervous, assuring that she had absolutely nothing to do with it. Liana grabbed her sister's hand, asking how she could say such a thing when it came to a small child. Elisha screamed. The baby didn't exist for her at all, and it seemed like this conversation was causing her too much pain. She believed she had no daughter and asked her sister never to mention her again. Liana noticed that a minute ago Elisha could barely stand on her feet, but suddenly she had incredible strength. The girl had a magic ring with a bright red ruby on her hand, but Liana had absolutely no idea what was happening. She felt as if something was being torn out from within, and her sister was indignant that the lady had started making a scene, although she had always been silent before. She held Liana's hand tightly and asked her not to do anything else without her knowledge. The ring continued to flash with a bright light, while the sister insisted that no matter what Liana did, nothing would change in this life. The heroine managed to notice that the brighter her sister's ring shone, the weaker her body became. She felt her strength fading, and at some point Liana could no longer stand on her feet, involuntarily closing her eyes. The girl was ready to faint because her body was so weak that she was completely unable to stand. And by a lucky chance, the emperor was there again, supporting her by the waist, and her sister decided to simply leave silently. She only asked Liana not to forget her words and never to talk to her about this topic again. Elisha did not respond to Liana's request to stop and continue the conversation. The emperor held the girl by the waist because she could barely stand on her feet, but at that moment, the heroine was worried that this was how it all happened. It turned out that Enoch heard a loud noise and immediately hurried to the balcony, worried that something might have happened between the sisters. Liana was grateful that he was there in time. She just felt like she should have told him only about Ariel. She even laughed when she realized that the young man was very scared and saw how her legs gave way. And she asked him to forgive her for worrying him with her family squabbles, assuring him that she was really okay. The emperor noticed something strange and asked what the lady had managed to do to her in such a short time. He clearly felt that the girl's body was completely cold, as if all the life force had left it. After talking with Liana, Elisha was so angry that she went to her room and started throwing objects in different directions. She was irritated. Her sister had suddenly changed, the emperor too, and she couldn't understand what was happening. She tried to remove the magic ring from her finger, but for some reason, it wouldn't budge. And as soon as she tried to do this, a knight in armor entered her room who definitely could not be here. Elisha angrily shouted at the knight to get out of her room immediately, and he definitely could not have entered here without her permission. The young man in armor remained silent for some reason, and only smiled involuntarily as he confidently entered the room. This irritated the girl even more, and it seemed to her that this man was deliberately ignoring her. She managed to remove the magic ring, but as soon as Lydia changed it, she became even angrier. Elisha pushed the knight away and once again asked him to leave her chambers immediately. But at that moment, the ring ended up in the hands of the knight, and he said that he was now holding something of great value. The knight warned her not to throw away the precious ring so rashly, and gave it into the lady's hands. This ring was made with all the heart by a kind person, and the girl should handle it with more care. Elisha was scared. No one was supposed to know about this ring except her father, her, and the person who created it. Right in front of her stood a stranger who also knew about the ring, but Elisha did not recognize this man at all. The knight suddenly realized that the girl would hardly recognize him in this form, and at that moment he was enveloped in magical power. The armor disappeared from the young man's body, and he appeared before the lady as a young man with bright scarlet eyes. He showed his true form. Elisha recognized him immediately, and just think, the Duke was stuck on the battlefield at such a crucial moment. The young man touched the ring and warned that strength must be replenished regularly, and only in this way will the magic ring work. He admitted that in any case they would meet the lady, and hoped that next time she would give them a warmer welcome. The young man's magical appearance disappeared, and for a long time he anticipated his epic return. Elisha was left alone in the room again, and she certainly didn't expect to meet him at that moment. Before disappearing, the young man invited the girl to go with him. She understood perfectly well that she needed to do this. She touched the magic ring and said through clenched teeth, "They need to go." All this time, the emperor stood on the balcony with Liana, and the girl took a long time to come to her senses. Her body was still cold for some reason, and the emperor couldn't even warm up. It was strange, and he felt warmth from her. The emperor was incredibly kind, but for some reason he continued to hug Liana, carefully and reverently. On the one hand, the girl was pleased with such attention, but she asked to at least loosen the grip a little. She touched his hand and asked if he still didn't feel the warmth from her that had come before. It was all too strange, and after her sister's magical influence, something began to happen to Liana's body. She didn't really notice anything, but ever since Elisha grabbed his wrist, for some reason the emperor didn't feel any strength. He touched Liana's hand again, not understanding why her body had stopped emitting fiery energy. The emperor felt that his heart was not warmed now, and the touch did not produce any reaction. It was as if only a weak particle of power remained, but it was so insignificant that the emperor could barely notice it. Liana couldn't believe it, and she tried to understand what had happened in those few seconds of conversation with her sister. When Elisha grabbed her, the heroine felt like something was leaking out of her, and perhaps that could be the reason. The emperor had never heard of such a thing. His sister certainly hadn't drunk the girl's blood, and it sounded simply impossible. But still, such an option is also possible suddenly. In the slightest probability, the heroine's ability really did disappear in an instant. And now Liana was most afraid that in that case the emperor could lose control just by touching her, and she immediately asked him to let go of her hand in order to figure out as soon as possible why the energy left her body. Liana began to worry that if her power had truly disappeared, then the emperor should under no circumstances touch her. Enoch didn't want the girl to let go of her hands, and he felt a faint, pulsing magic within her. The magic was indeed very weak, but it still seethed inside Liana, and the young man felt a faint warmth. They stood there, hugging each other on the balcony, and Liana tremblingly pressed herself against Enoch's chest. She noticed that for some reason the emperor looked very worried, burying his face in her fragile shoulder. But if the heroine's power really disappears, she will no longer be able to stop the rampage of dark magic, and the emperor was probably afraid of this. It was still dangerous for them to be close now, but the emperor did not let the girl go until the magic pendant vibrated in his pocket. Liana was about to answer the call, but hugging the emperor, she couldn't reach the magic pendant. Finally, she felt the treasured chain on his back and pressed the button to answer the call. A voice came from the pendant, immediately greeting Her Majesty Lady Liana. The call seemed to be extremely important, but the emperor paid no attention while his assistants tried to find out whether the girl was still in the mansion. For some reason, the young men excitedly demanded that they not leave the room under any circumstances, and if they were not there, then return back immediately. Soon the emperor managed to come to his senses despite the cold curse raging in his chest. However, not a day had passed since the heroine had promised to be his medicine, and now she was about to begin a completely different life. The emperor was surprised. Did Liana really remember that she promised to be his medicine? Or were you indignant? She didn't drink that much. Now the lady was most worried about whether, if her power had really disappeared, she would be able to regain her abilities. The emperor warned that they would probably have to ask the elder about this to find out the details. The elder was the same man whom Liana had already seen earlier in the communication stone. It was a young man with long black hair and a mustache who at that very second burst into her room with loud shouts. Liana certainly didn't expect to see him here, but as soon as he came in to introduce himself, she immediately realized that he was definitely an elder. He did not arrive alone, but with another man who was in a hurry to talk to the emperor. The heroes looked at the guests in surprise while they argued with each other and tried to figure out who should immediately lock the door. The elders entered the room without warning and asked the emperor to open the door for at least a second. Liana understood that the matter was probably serious, but she had absolutely no idea what it all meant. And probably today the doors of this mansion will definitely be broken down because of the indignant elders. The white elder and the black elder expressed their great respect and reverence to the lady. In response, Liana greeted the guests with a smile on her face, but one of the elders allowed her not to be so formal. The elder said that it so happened that several nobles from the Duke's entourage heard about Liana's presence here and created a commotion over a trifle. The lady felt insecure because it was because of her that the emperor was now drawn into some trouble. The elders did not understand why the lady was apologizing, since the Duke was the only one to blame for everything. It was the first time they had seen the emperor hold someone's hand so carefully, as if nothing had happened. The elder of the blacks was surprised that the emperor was not at all violent and suggested returning to the palace to avoid meeting these people. At that moment he noticed that His Majesty had bright red ears, and something definitely happened here. Liana said that His Majesty was simply a little confused, but none of the elders could believe that the emperor was embarrassed. She spoke of her strength, which warmed the emperor, and also of how, after one incident, she weakened. Something had definitely happened since then, and the girl hadn't mentioned it during her morning conversation with the elders. Having heard the strange news, the elder suggested finding out the details later, but for now he offered to take the girl by the hand. Touching her hand, he felt that the strength had definitely weakened, but it was recovering on its own, so Liana should recover soon. And until His Majesty starts to rage, no problems should arise. The Black Elder confirmed that in that case they should not worry and that it might happen. He didn't even have time to finish his sentence because the next second, something happened that no one expected. The elder turned around and saw someone trying to open the door to the living room, clearly wanting to come in. Indeed, a couple of seconds later, two men burst through the door and immediately addressed the emperor. The turquoise-haired youth shouted, "Even if His Majesty is the emperor, his behavior is beyond all bounds." He was indignant. The emperor decided to send the Duke to certain death, unarmed, just for a light slap in the face of his mistress. The emperor turned sharply away from the young man, who continued to insist that the Duke was a very sensitive person and that this act was cruel to him. "This young man has just done a great deed. He dared to touch the emperor himself. A cold, frosty spot immediately appeared on my wrist, and huge snowflakes began to swirl around me." Enoch tried to quickly warn the lady that everything was fine. It was just a light touch that would not cause serious consequences. The elder shouted that the young man was allowing himself to do this, and even if he was upset, he should not have touched the emperor. His manners were indeed disrespectful, and it all happened only because the emperor refused to receive this man. A fierce wolf's grin appeared on his face, and the young man himself was exhausted with indignation and anger. But the elders noticed that even in all this chaos, the lady remained firmly by the emperor's side, not retreating a single step. There were already bad rumors circulating about Liana, and this man was sure that it was not surprising that the Duke had to take such measures. One of them was even terribly worried whether the prepared food would be to the master's taste. The emperor said that if the young men were so worried, why don't they go with the Duke to the battlefield, and he even promised to open a teleportation portal for them. None of them wanted this outcome. One began to insist that everything was perfectly fine with him and that he was not in the best physical shape, and the other did not have any documents at all. At that moment, the emperor closed his eyes and seemed to be suffocating, and Liana realized that he was definitely not feeling well. The gentleman's neck was covered with frosty white frost, but he continued to insist that he was fine. Liana didn't understand what she needed to do, and no matter how much she touched the emperor, he didn't warm up at all. If this continues, the nobles will notice that something is wrong with His Majesty, and it was necessary to hide a terrible secret. The emperor was getting worse with each passing minute, and Liana, looking at the helpless man, did not understand what to do or how to help him. One of the elders began to prompt something, pointing his fingers to his own mouth, trying to explain to the girl what to do. For some reason, he pointed to his lips, and she was probably supposed to do something with the emperor's lips. She tried to understand what the elder wanted to say by this, but she couldn't figure it out at all. Liana's expression seemed to become more and more stupid, but she definitely heard that they were talking about lips. The elder realized that the girl definitely did not hear his words, and decided to explain to her with hand gestures. He placed his 2 index fingers together, and the gesture could only mean one thing. Right now, the elder was offering Liana to kiss the emperor to ease his terrible curse. Of course, the heroine agreed to be a cure for Enoch, but nevertheless, she believed that the kiss was too much. She had no time to think at all, because the emperor's face had already begun to turn to ice. Enoch found himself in this situation because he had helped the girl yesterday, and she realized that now she had to help him. She touched his face with her hands, and to stop this madness, she had to kiss him right now. Liana even warned him that there was no romance involved and that this was just part of the treatment that he desperately needed right now. Liana touched her lips to Enoch's. She felt an icy cold run through her veins, but at the same moment a wave of warmth emanating from Enoch. The cold was so piercing that the girl even felt as if she was being cut by sharp needles from the inside. She understood that the emperor must be suffering even more now, and she had to help him. When she pulled away, the emperor took a shuddering breath, and the blue on his face began to recede, the icy patterns began to melt. She did it. She saved the emperor. But now what will happen to the heroine, and what does this kiss mean for them? A frightened Liana said that the emperor almost lost his composure in front of all the guests and elders. As soon as the young man woke up, he saw only Liana's sweet face, as well as the warm touch of her lips. The magic of their kiss wove into a complex pattern, fighting against the curse that was destroying the emperor. This kiss, an act of selfless bravery, revealed a completely new side of Liana to him. The emperor felt like a boy who had encountered true beauty and courage for the first time. Liana tried to convince herself that it was just a treatment and asked if the emperor felt the cold, because the kiss definitely worked. And only now did she realize that the other heroes had been watching them closely all this time, and that she had just kissed the emperor in front of them. People began to discuss, the rumors were true, and just now the lady pounced on His Majesty in the middle of the pour. She kissed him to prevent the imminent threat, but she did not think at all about the consequences. The lady confessed to the emperor, his face was turning red. If this continues, the situation will get worse. Suddenly, someone present suggested that everyone calm down as quickly as possible to avoid trouble. The elders volunteered to stop this madness, and they understood that the emperor felt uneasy. They tried to help their master, but for some reason Liana felt uneasy. The young men could not understand at all what was happening, why His Majesty and the young lady kissed right in front of them. One of them remembered that at yesterday's banquet the two were holding hands, and there were already too many rumors circulating throughout the empire. And only one thing occurred to everyone, that there was a relationship between them. To defuse the situation, one of the elders declared that the emperor was engaged to this girl, and no one else should interfere in this matter. In 1 second, Liana's life changed dramatically, and she couldn't believe how she got into such an absurd situation. The elders pretended not to understand anything, thoughtfully crunching on chocolate cookies. Thanks to this sensation, everyone remained silent for now, but in that case, Liana would have had to become empress. The elder warned that for now, until everything was settled, it would be better if she pretended to be in love. Enoch was incredibly sad to get the girl involved in this, and she ended up in this mess precisely because of him. Liana did not want the young man to feel guilty under any circumstances, because she herself wanted to help him. She looked down, trying to hide her confusion and the excitement that had suddenly awakened in her. She wanted to run away, hide, and think about everything that had happened. His dark eyes, usually full of confidence, now seemed deeper, and she felt how this short moment of touching lips changed everything. She admitted once again that she was actually worried that she would cause trouble for the emperor, but she was very glad that she was able to help. The elders were confident that the situation could actually turn out to be quite favorable for the girl, because she needs to make contact to stop His Majesty's rampage and terrible curse. And it would be more reasonable to have a reason for physical contact than to do it without any explanation. All this time, Liana was sure that Ariel was with the butler, but suddenly a child's voice was heard in the living room. The little girl managed to crawl all the way here, probably while the butler was briefly distracted. Ariel crawled out from behind the curtain and loudly said her first word, "Mom," to the whole living room. Liana was scared that the girl had managed to get in there, and it was no surprise that she couldn't find her after the partition collapsed. The baby sneezed. It's incredible that while she was playing behind the curtains, you managed to breathe in dust. The lady carefully took the girl in her arms because she was crawling straight towards her and was happy to see her. An even sweeter smile appeared on the elders' faces for some reason. They all looked towards the lady. They clearly noticed that the little girl looked exactly like Liana, and she was perfectly aware of it. The only thought that came to the elders was that this little girl was the mistress's daughter. The elder of the blacks could not help but exclaim, "Could this really be the sweet child of His Majesty and the young lady?" The heroes were already uncomfortable after the kissing situation, but now each of them felt even more terrible. None of the elders knew. They had been holding hands for barely a month, and where the child might come from. Still, the man could not take his eyes off the little girl, who looked incredibly similar to Liana. She said that this child, who for some reason calls her mom, is her cousin's child. At the most inopportune moment, for some reason, Ariel, who had previously been uttering incoherent sounds, now looked at the Emperor and called him Daddy. An awkward pause hung over the heroes, and Liana couldn't quite explain why the little girl was calling the Emperor Daddy. It turns out that she really did just call Enoch her daddy, and those were the baby's first words. Liana asked the elders not to misunderstand her, assuring her that the little girl still spoke very poorly. The little girl pointed her little hand at the elders and loudly pronounced the word grandfather. She looked happily at the pieces of bread and named them, and almost said the word Choco. The elder noted that the little girl was very smart for her age and she spoke very well, but Ariel categorically refused to call the Emperor and the lady by their names, and only them she called Mommy and Daddy. In any case, it was Liana's cousin's daughter, who was simply left with her for a while, so she asked the elders not to draw strange conclusions. The elders began to discuss out loud that it was okay, and there were still plenty of opportunities, and they could definitely make it happen. In any case, they considered it a blessing because the young lady was able to pacify His Majesty. She asked the elders about the ice shard in his heart, and asked if they could get rid of it. The heroes had already seen that physical contact during an attack warmed the Emperor, but beyond that, she understood what they knew. One of the elders had a hunch, but he wanted to study it further before making any statements. Another elder asked to establish contact and touch the Emperor in order to see everything with his own eyes. He was even sure that Liana should hold hands with the Emperor every time, hug, and do whatever it takes to melt his heart. Still, it was surprising, and as far as the elders knew, the girl had no fire abilities. This is exactly what the Emperor was going to ask about, and magic is needed to melt the ice in his heart. He even suggested that perhaps the girl's fire ability was actually inside her, but was probably stolen by someone. Liana didn't expect that things would turn out this way, and she really does have strong abilities. The Emperor decided to tell the elders that when the lady touched Liana, it seemed to him that the power inside her suddenly disappeared. It was indeed true, the girl admitted. She felt that something had really left her body. The elders thought about it, and this option was quite possible, but it was only necessary for the person who wanted to suppress the lady's magical abilities. One of them asked if Liana had noticed anything strange when she came into contact with the lady. Trying to remember every little detail of that conversation, the girl actually remembered an important detail. On the lady's hand was a silver ring with a huge stone, which she noticed that day. Elisha was wearing a ring with a red gemstone, which seemed to emit a ruby glow during their conversation. The moment the ring touched her skin, she felt as if something had been ripped out of her, as if something had disappeared inside. Hearing about the red gem, the elders began to talk excitedly. Probably something was known about this. The white elder suddenly asked the Emperor to return to the palace for a moment and use the teleportation portal. He disappeared literally the next second, and Liana realized that things were probably serious. The elder went to the palace and returned by teleportation with a wooden box decorated with gold carvings. As soon as the heroine told him about the red ruby, he decided to bring this box, remembering the words of the young lady. There was a huge, precious stone lying on black velvet in the box, and the elder asked if it was similar to the one Liana had seen on her sister. Looking closely at the stone, Liana realized that it was similar, but it was much smaller and the color was richer. She carefully decided to touch the magic stone with one finger to see if she felt the same. And as soon as she touched the huge ruby with her fingertip, she realized that she had experienced exactly the same sensations. The heroine had never felt like this before. She realized that she was completely fine, but something strange was happening to her. Judging by the elders' expressions, they understood what was going on and what effect the magic stone was emitting. The huge ruby was called the Dragon's Heart, and it was not just a jewel, but a stone that concealed mysteries. The heroine knew nothing about this stone, and this was the first time she had heard the name of the Dragon's Heart. It seemed that the gemstone she saw on Elisha was indeed the heart of a dragon, and depending on the dragon's affiliation, this stone was capable of absorbing the power that suited it. Liana didn't understand what it all meant, but the Emperor knew that it seemed the elder was indeed right, because the Emperor no longer felt the fiery power of the girl, which acted on him in a strong stream as before. Liana had no abilities, but despite the elder's surprise, they realized that the young lady had a magical gift. It was quite possible that something had changed when the heroine had entered this body, and now magic was truly raging inside her. But most of all, Liana was afraid that if she disrupted the course of the novel, it could end badly for all the characters. The elder asked to look at the magic stone, and asked if the girl could see the flame inside it. This flame was Liana's power, which took shape after being absorbed by the dragon's heart. Most likely the gem that was in the lady's ring was a fragment of a dragon's heart, passed down through the Duke's family. The Emperor asked if this stone was exactly like the one the girl had seen before at Elisha's. The glow of the magic stone was exactly the same, but the lady's stone was more red in color, and the stone itself was a bright blood-red color. The Emperor thought so. The Duke's fragment had probably become dulled over the generation. Its power had most likely faded as well. This explanation was quite logical, and this time Liana was not in such a bad situation, and she was still conscious. But that stone was so scarlet, like thick blood, and she remembered it clearly. The elders assumed that then that red tint could only mean one thing, and they were completely sure of it. If the heart was recently removed, its color will be blood red, but the older it is, the more faded its color and strength become. The elder had not heard any recent news about the dragon's death, although another recalled a recent incident. The White Elder told about the rumors. There are rumors everywhere. The dragon of the Western Forest died unexpectedly. Hearing this, the Emperor looked at the elders in surprise, and he himself heard this information for the first time. He asked if it was really the fool who was so recklessly careless. The elder said that the Emperor was indeed right. It was about Lord Carcass, and they said that his heart was missing. While no one was sure about it, his heart really did disappear, and Liana noticed that Ariel began to behave strangely. It was also said that the dragon was expecting offspring, but only one case was found, which means that either the child ran away with the mother, or this was false information. Suddenly, little Liana started crying, and the Emperor declared that the Lord never listened to him when he told him not to trust everyone. It is quite possible that the stone in the young lady's ring is indeed the heart of a dragon. But Liana couldn't understand where Elisha got something like that from, and who knows, she could have just stumbled upon it by accident. The Emperor was probably restless, thinking that if only he could kill the Western dragon and take his heart for selfish purposes. In any case, the elders asked the girl to be careful, and if she sees such a gem again, she should know that it is capable of solving her problems. The Emperor warned them to avoid contact with the young lady, at least until they figured out why she had this item. But most of all, the heroine was worried about little Ariel, and really wanted the investigation to take place as quickly as possible. Now the heroine knew the terrible truth about Elisha and realized that she really needed to be more careful. As soon as the elder said the words about Lord Carcass, suddenly little Ariel began to cry loudly. Liana couldn't understand why the girl was behaving this way and what happened to her at that moment. The Emperor suggested that perhaps the baby was hungry, since she had spilled her milk and was not full at all. Having decided to leave for a while, Liana went to feed the baby, and the Emperor offered to go with her. The heroine decided that everything would be fine, and everything would go faster if she went alone. Enoch became even more worried and asked the lady to just be careful and not fall somewhere in a hurry. The young man gently touched her face and looked into her eyes with concern, and Liana promised to be as careful as possible. The elders' faces expressed complete affection as they looked at the caring relationship between the Emperor and the girl. One of the elders shouted at the lady not to forget something, and the heroine became afraid that she had forgotten something again. The Elder of the Blacks once again reminded the heroine that in order to melt the ice in His Majesty's heart, something needed to be done. Specifically, Liana must touch the Emperor as often as possible so that the magical shard will finally melt. While another elder asked him not to focus only on the child, but to solve other problems, the emperor gently covered his mouth with his hand and asked Liana once again to take care of herself. Now the lady was worried. The baby had been crying all this time as if she was about to pass out, and it was good that she had finally calmed down. Anyone who saw this would definitely think that this was some kind of wedding ceremony. The elders continued to admire the girl, and the emperor decided to have a serious talk with them. He asked for their attention for a moment, and judging by the emperor's menacing look, one thing was obvious. As soon as the lady walked out the door, his face became cold and threatening again, and the elders understood that they were in for a serious conversation. He decided to discuss an important topic with them and asked for an investigation into the connection between the Duchy of Harrington and Liana. The elders were surprised because even if this was a connection between the duchy and the young lady, it could be an ordinary relationship. The emperor didn't think so. It seemed to him that this was not the first time the duke had raised his hand against Liana, which was outrageous in itself. He asked them to approach the issue responsibly and find out if there was anything they didn't know about Liana and Elisha's abilities. The elders told the emperor not to worry and promised to find out everything, right down to how many spoons the duke's family had. The emperor understood that this would be unnecessary, but he believed that the wise elders would be able to sort this issue out. After all, until this time he actually knew absolutely nothing about Liana and her family. The emperor was blinded by the fact that the girl could suppress the ice shard and thought about nothing else the entire time, and in his thoughts hovered that tender, unexpected kiss and the touch of Liana's velvety lips. The elders noticed that the emperor blushed at the thought of this, and even thought that perhaps the emperor had caught a cold and it was necessary to call the royal physician. A few days later, early in the morning, Liana was drinking green tea, but her face clearly showed confusion. Several days had already passed since she had suddenly become the emperor's false lover, and from that day on he had not approached her again. Just recently, he ran after Liana at every opportunity, begging her to touch him, and did not leave her side for a single step. Liana wondered what the point was of her agreeing to be his medicine, if the one who needed healing wouldn't even deign to come near her. She said this out loud, and the stunned emperor seemed to even stop breathing after her words. All this time, Liana was tormented by thoughts about the kiss. She couldn't understand what was going on. And she even decided that her kiss had really been so unpleasant that the emperor categorically refused to approach her. But she only did it because she was worried about the young man, and now he was definitely going too far. After this, the heroine tried her best to follow the elders' instructions to establish physical contact, but the emperor did not lift a finger after that. At the morning tea party, the black elder admitted that a charity event would soon take place. Liana didn't understand what she had to do with it, and the elder asked the lady to attend this event as the emperor's partner. Even without this, the heroine was embarrassed to death, and now the elder wanted her to appear before everyone as his companion. Even though she was His Majesty's beloved just for show, the elder still insisted that the lady come. The elder assured that the emperor would wander around completely alone, would probably quarrel with other couples without any reason, and would touch something unusual without any caution and get out of control. They even suggested that in that case, they would have to drag the emperor's frozen body back to the palace. But if the lady was completely unwilling to go, nothing could be done, and the elders had no choice but to endure the difficulties. The men managed to persuade Liana, and after these facts she said that she would go with the emperor to the event. The elder was delighted and called this wonderful news, suggesting that the girl hurry up and prepare for the reception. Liana asked if they couldn't just call someone, but the elders both took on important matters. They described the heroes as young people who are always stuck indoors and who definitely shouldn't miss the opportunity to take a walk together in the fresh air. Liana was worried about who would look after little Ariel, who had been with them all this time. The little girl waved her little hand and said goodbye to Liana, and something flew by like she was going to play with her grandfathers. The lady looked at Ariel with surprised eyes, because just now she had decided to play with the elders on her own. Ariel could already say such short phrases, and the children really did grow up so quickly. Some still doubted that the heroes were really a couple, and Liana said they would be lucky if they didn't look like sworn enemies. The emperor didn't even look her in the eye, and after these words she noticed that the young man again turned as red as a lobster. He still didn't say what the matter was and avoided eye contact with Liana in every possible way. However, the heroine once promised that she would become his medicine and help the emperor avoid the terrible curse. The imperial town lived its ordinary, measured life, filled with beauty, harmony, and sophistication. The heroes went for a walk. and the lady noted that calling the emperor by his name was a little strange. The elder warned that when they go out into the world, even if they are not affectionate, they should at least call each other by their personal names. Liana decided that it would be most convenient to also call the young man His Majesty and simply return to the communication that had been between them before. But the emperor categorically refused and asked the girl to call him by his name, but the heroine did not hear his words because of the ringing of the bells. A little embarrassed, the young man actually asked Liana to call him Enoch. For some reason, it had been incredibly difficult for the heroine to call him by name up until this moment, but everything turned out to be much easier. Lately, the emperor had become a little shy, and Liana had definitely noticed it. She agreed to call him by name, asking him to follow her, but suddenly her friend stopped and asked if she would not pronounce his name. Liana didn't understand what he wanted to achieve from her, and asked if he was simply asking her to call him by his name. It wasn't that difficult, but the girl offered to take his hand and promised to tell him his name. The emperor hesitated a little, and the lady assumed that he probably did not want to take her hand and turned away. For some reason, Enoch still stood there, his cheeks bright red, and continued to look at Liana. He took her hand, and the girl asked if he did it with such ease. Then why didn't he do it earlier? Liana asked if the emperor was really offended by her, and she could not understand anything at all because the young man did not say anything. She didn't even notice how she said his name out loud, and a sweet smile appeared on the emperor's face. Liana laughed, and really, she had just said his name, and for some reason after that she felt incredibly funny. The emperor asked why this made the girl happy, but he in turn smiled back at her. Enoch admitted a smile appeared on his face for one reason, no doubt, because he was simply happy. The young man hadn't heard his name for a long time. No one had said it for so long, and he was simply glad about it. And for him now it was ordinary happiness, just to hear his name called. The emperor could not even imagine that it could be so pleasant, and the surprised Liana heard her heart beating. It was an incredibly sweet moment. Both heroes were embarrassed by what was happening. They even found it difficult to look each other in the eyes. Liana decided to go into a certain shop first, but the heroes had no idea that someone was watching them the whole time. The stranger smelled that very aroma that gave him goosebumps, and it was Liana's aroma. All this time they were being watched by a young man with burgundy eyes and long silver hair who immediately recognized Lady Harrington. For some reason, Liana suddenly felt nervous, and an overwhelming fear spread through every cell of her body. The emperor noticed this immediately and could only guess what was going on. The heroes went into a cozy establishment to drink a cup of tea and relax a little before their walk. The emperor was surprised because all this time she had been greedily drinking water as if it were an alcoholic drink, and the lady admitted that she was simply trying to sober up. Her words sounded too strange, and Enoch was puzzled as to what had happened to the girl during this time. She asked the emperor to forget, and assumed that she must have been scared, because the young man suddenly brought his beautiful face close to hers. In fact, Liana was simply scared for no reason, and now she could finally calmly hold the emperor's hand. She touched his hand, and her heart began to beat so loudly that the lady was even afraid that the emperor could hear this knock. But he took up his duties again, and after she called him by name, the emperor began to look into her eyes more often and even come closer. For some reason he kept slipping away, and Liana couldn't find an answer to this question, suggesting that the emperor simply have a sincere conversation. Liana asked why Enoch continued to avoid her and whether he was simply uncomfortable with her touch. After taking a sip of aromatic tea, Enoch admitted that the girl was definitely mistaken in her opinion and that this could not be. In that case, she asked him to take her hand again, since the emperor had never touched her since then. She held her hand out in front of him and abruptly demanded that he finally touch her. The emperor noticed Liana's agitated state and asked her to sit back down, promising to touch her hand. He took off his black leather glove, and a crimson blush appeared on his cheeks from embarrassment. He gently touched her incredibly pleasant skin with his fingertips, and she felt these emotions again. He touched her with just one finger, while Liana looked at everything that was happening with bewilderment. The heroine asked if the emperor really thought that this could be considered a full-fledged touch. Didn't he hear what the elder said, who told him to contact as often as possible to find out how well the ice was melting? The heroine wasn't sure if she could scold the emperor like that, but he simply answered and acted completely differently. Liana was indignant. Did he seriously think that such touches could melt such a terrible, powerful curse? Getting up from the table, the heroine admitted that touching bodies would be much more effective than using hands. Unexpectedly, Liana headed straight towards the emperor, while the excited young man asked her to stop, because they were in a cafe. Enoch was so confused that he suddenly confessed that it was all because his heart was hurting. Liana heard this information for the first time and asked if the emperor really had a bad heart. She leaned against his chest to listen and asked how serious his illness was. The confused emperor looked at the girl's behavior while she listened to the beating of his heart and asked if he was suffering from arrhythmia or something like that. The young man realized he couldn't hold on any longer and said he wanted to go out for some fresh air. Judging by his behavior, Liana was scared of what was going on, and perhaps everything was too serious. Suddenly, she felt a chill run down her spine and realized that there was definitely someone behind her. Looking back, the lady saw a man in a white robe with gold embroidery, but she definitely didn't recognize him. Taking a closer look at the stranger, the heroine saw silvery, almost white hair, as well as huge ruby eyes. She quietly said his name, Arun, and continued to look at the mysterious guest with frightened eyes. A strange aura emanated from this man, and he only smiled slyly and thanked the girl for the treat. The stranger approached Liana and bit her neck like a vampire, a powerful pulse of energy rolling through his body like a lightning strike. Liana found herself completely defenseless against this sudden attack. The stranger, whose face was hidden by the shadow of his hood, did not take his eyes off her neck. She hit the young man sharply on the head, shouting at him why he was acting like a complete psycho. The stranger probably didn't expect such bold behavior from the fragile girl who was holding his hair. A menacing grimace appeared on her face, and Liana held the bite on her neck with one hand, while with the other she held tightly to the stranger's hair. This young man turned out to be the master of the magic tower named Arun, and this character was well known to the heroine. The first major male character in the novel, and one of those who hates Liana with a passion, and is something of a substitute for tormenting Elisha. He was the kind of guy who would start kissing Elisha on the neck in broad daylight, so Liana always tried to avoid him and yelled at him to finally get off her. She grabbed him by the hair with both hands and ordered him to let go, promising that she would definitely leave him his silver locks. Liana warned again that she had asked to let him go the easy way, but she did not understand why this man had attacked her, even though Elisha was not there. For some reason, Arun demanded to enjoy another bite, but the heroine insistently demanded that he leave her alone as quickly as possible. She screamed loudly and called him a real maniac. The next second, the young man received a blow to the head from the fragile lady. Arun was taken aback because he was sure that the girl should take this for granted and not refuse him to bite her again. Liana said that the young man was behaving too strangely and biting her neck at the first meeting, like a real pervert. Arun admitted that he simply couldn't resist because while walking around the city, he smelled something very tasty and aromatic. That's why he found Liana and decided to try to enjoy her blood while all the guests of the establishment watched intently. In the original, Arun bit the main character on the neck the first time they met, and he was not himself from the very beginning. Who knows what this could lead to, and the lady decided that she needed to get him out of here before the emperor noticed him. But as soon as she thought about it, she realized that Enoch was already standing next to them, watching. The master of the magic tower opened his eyes in surprise as soon as the emperor approached them. Liana called the emperor by name. Arun asked if she really didn't know who he was and was out of her mind. Arun confidently stated that the girl could not just shout out His Majesty's name right in front of all the people of the city. Then he heard the emperor himself call the girl by name, and this could only mean one thing. He called the girl that wayward cousin who was trying to destroy the noble lady, while Liana begged him to let her go. The master of the magic tower heard earlier that the girl did not have any abilities and would definitely not be able to resist him, but he couldn't understand one thing: why she smelled so delicious and why he was attracted by the aroma of strong magic. Arun looked at the girl's neck again and realized that everything that was happening was too strange. Liana pushed the young man away from her neck again and screamed that he was allowing himself to do this in front of the emperor. All this time, Enoch stood silently and watched the behavior of the master of the magic tower, whom he knew well. The young man came closer and sternly told the master to immediately move away from Liana and stop pestering her. Just half an hour ago, the emperor was standing in the courtyard of the establishment, breathing fresh air and trying to sort out his thoughts. Enoch just wished that he would never die as the blush continued to spread across his face. The emperor incredibly wanted to touch this girl, but it seemed he couldn't, and waited for this strange sensation to pass. According to the elder, if he continues to live as usual, everything will soon get better, but if the ice melts, side effects are possible. The young man had noticed long ago that since that day his body had been behaving very strangely. The elders tried to find out from the master whether he was really sure of this, but the emperor could not explain what had happened because he himself could not really figure it out. Ever since he kissed Liana, every time he saw her, his heart pounded wildly, his face burned, even if they did not touch each other. And as soon as their gaze met, all his thoughts disappeared instantly, and he told the elders about this. Even when Liana was not around, he continued to think about her and her velvety, tender lips. The emperor said that this seemed unusual, and his heart always fluttered at the sight of this girl. The elder then admitted that it looked like a healing reaction, but he was sure that it was not like that at all. The healing reaction is a natural reaction that occurs as the body recovers, so the elder assured that there is no need to worry too much. The black elder was outraged. The healing reaction sounded ridiculous, and the white elder insisted that he was ruining all the fun. They understood that it was not at all difficult until the emperor asked what he should do then, and whether he should simply continue as before. The elders said that as long as the emperor maintains regular contact with Lady Liana, he will be able to recover in the shortest possible time. Enoch was the most worried. At this rate, his heart might not be able to take it first, but he might recover soon. Although this was evidence of his recovery, for some reason this thought did not console him in the least. Now that the emperor had once felt the warmth again when he saw Liana, he wanted to reach out to her and ask her to touch him. This happened especially when the girl approached him. His face began to burn even before she touched him. When he was alone, he managed to calm down, and perhaps it all happened because of his rapid heartbeat. Perhaps the emperor decided he should turn to the elders for something that could slow down his pulse. As soon as he returned back to the cozy cafe, he saw some stranger greedily grab Lady Liana by the neck. This sight shocked the emperor, and he immediately approached to figure out what was going on. As soon as Arun saw the emperor, he immediately took a step away from the girl, looking at him with frightened eyes. He admitted it was pure chance, and that he had just remembered something extremely urgent. It was immediately clear that the young man was going to run away, but he had just bitten the girl on the neck and didn't even apologize. After opening the magic portal, the master of the magic tower suddenly disappeared without a trace and swore it was not on purpose. Seriously, the heroine has met all sorts of weirdos in her life, but this one turned out to be the weirdest. The emperor approached Liana to make sure she was okay, and the heroine noticed his worried face. There were bite marks visible on her neck, and scarlet blood was dripping from the small wounds. For some reason, Enoch asked a very strange question and wondered if Lady Diana had also stroked the tower master. There was a deep sadness on his face, and he wanted to know if Lady Liana had touched him too. This time, too many strange things happened on the walk, and the heroes calmly rode back in the carriage. On the way, Liana looked out the window and looked thoughtful, and never said a word. After some time, she asked the emperor if he was upset by anything that had happened that day. Enoch looked at the girl with concern, but admitted that he was completely fine. But Liana felt that the emperor was blatantly lying, and he had been like this ever since she told him about what happened to the tower master. All this time, the emperor seemed to be out of his mind, and even looked as if through space. Suddenly, the young man admitted that, frankly speaking, he was not at all confident in his words, and probably felt something else. The young man said he was experiencing strange sensations. Something was pressing in his chest, as if something was stuck there. But the emperor did not understand at all what this feeling was, because he had never experienced anything like it before. After listening to his explanation, Liana suggested that perhaps it was similar to a feeling of frustration. Since the emperor was experiencing this for the first time, frankly speaking, he had absolutely no idea what was happening to him. They had a rather sincere conversation, and Enoch told her that since he met Liana, everything was new to him. Holding hands with someone, laughing while looking into their eyes, and just enjoying the ordinary moments of life. Even when Liana said his name for the first time today, his heart began to beat faster, and the emperor felt such warmth for the first time. All this was unusual and alien to him, because before he was a cold-blooded person who felt neither emotions nor pain. It was the first time the heroine had heard such frank words from the emperor, and this time he really opened up to her. She had previously assumed his life was different because he couldn't touch others, but perhaps he lived a much lonelier life than she had imagined. And if this feeling that he was now experiencing is what people call a disorder, then it could only happen for one reason. Because the emperor was able to see Liana interacting with another young man, this is what influenced his condition. Liana warned again that what happened earlier was a pure accident, and she had already explained everything. But watching her touch someone else, not him, the emperor felt incredible grief. Placing his hand on his chest, he admitted that he felt something heavy settle on his heart. It may have sounded childish, like a child's whim over a trifle, but the young man spoke about his feelings for the first time. And Liana was simply the only one he could touch, and it certainly didn't sound childish. Even though he knew it was completely normal, the simple fact that a girl could touch anyone still caused some pain. This is what it feels like when your first friend finds another friend, and for the Emperor, Liana was probably the first friend he ever had. After she got sucked into this affair, he was the first person she spoke to here, and Liana felt the same way. Now, the Emperor certainly did not expect that Liana would sincerely confess her feelings to him in response. She even stood up from her seat and loudly declared that he was the only one for her too. The silence was oppressive, causing her heart to beat an anxious tap dance. Liana slowly raised her head, meeting his piercing eyes. In them she always saw a reflection of her own soul, restless, seeking peace, thirsting for understanding. Therefore, the heroine confidently answered that she does not touch just anyone, and the only ones she touches are the Emperor and Ariel. And she certainly didn't pet the master of the magic tower, the cunning little fox, but practically pulled out all of his hair. Liana frankly told the Emperor that he was the only adult man whose head she had ever stroked, and she promised that it would continue this way in the future, and the young man definitely shouldn't worry about it. A cheerful, joyful smile lit up the Emperor's face, and he decided without a doubt to trust this girl. For some reason during this conversation, the heroine's heart was beating wildly, and she was worried that at this rate the young man would hear it too. The Emperor took the girl by the hand, but she understood that now was the very moment when she needed to step away. Enoch asked if this meant that only he was allowed to touch Liana and no other male. Technically, that was true, and Liana understood that she had just signed her own words. The young man approached the lady and looked at her neck, where bite marks were visible. Liana was afraid of such close contact, but somewhere deep down she trusted the Emperor. He touched it with his hand and removed the trace of the Tower Master's touch, so he decided that the bite should definitely be removed as well. He wanted to be the only one who ever touched her, and he couldn't stand competition. When he wanted to touch her neck, Liana was frightened by the touch and screamed at him, asking what he was doing. The young man just laughed and asked the girl to be careful because she could fall at any moment. As soon as he touched her neck with his fingertips, the young man realized that this wound definitely needed to be treated. When he touched it, she felt a strange pain that seemed to pierce her entire body. The small bite had actually swollen quite a bit, and it was starting to hurt more and more with each passing minute. The Emperor understood that if he had been there from the very beginning, nothing like this would have happened, and he felt incredibly sorry. In this situation, the young man could soon definitely hear Liana's heartbeat, so she asked him to move away a little. But, burying his face in the girl's shoulder, Enoch felt that he would like to linger in this moment and just a little longer. Now he finally felt alive again, while the heroine felt as if she were dying. And where did that guy go? Who blushed and trembled from a simple touch, who now deftly sat her on his lap. Sitting on his lap, Liana was worried about why the young man kept saying her name. Suddenly, the young man asked whether Liana had been serious during the conversation just now. He said she promised that only he would be able to touch her, and no other young men would approach her. It doesn't matter that the heroine said this to calm him down, but now it has become quite difficult to deny. So, in order for Enoch to finally calm down, she said tenderly that only he could really touch her. The Emperor asked the lady to promise that from now on, she would not allow anyone but him to touch her. It didn't even sound like an ultimatum, and so Liana happily promised to do just that. He needed proof not only in fine words, but also in actions. Liana didn't understand why words alone weren't enough, and whether there was some kind of imperial tradition or etiquette for this. She decided to use a simpler method, and holding out her little finger, she declared that it was better to reinforce the words like this. The Emperor saw the strange gesture for the first time, and did not understand what he needed to do now. Liana showed with her fingers that it was necessary to clasp her little fingers and make a promise, and in this case the oath would be impossible to break. It was something like a vow, a promise, secured by a hand gesture, and it could be told in exactly that way. Enoch had never encountered anything like this before, but he trusted the girl and prepared to take off the black leather glove. After a brief hesitation, the young man realized that taking off the glove would not be such a good decision. But the most wonderful solution would be to seal this oath with the little fingers of both hands. He crossed his little finger and asked if he was doing everything right. At that moment, the young man really felt something strange and magical. Liana laughed and declared that now there was an official oath between them that must be kept. It was very sweet. The Emperor could not believe whether this was all true, and whether everything was really so simple. Liana warned that now whoever breaks the promise will be obliged to fulfill any wish of the other. She stroked his hair, noticing that it was sticking out in strange and funny ways. She continued to ruffle his hair, but the emperor seemed to enjoy it more and more. For some reason, he smiled a happy smile despite the fact that the heroine teased him about the mess on his head. The emperor admitted that he was truly happy for the first time in his life and felt it with every cell of his body. To be honest, when he saw Liana with the Tower Master, for a moment he felt a little scared. Fearing that someone might take Liana away, the emperor felt strong feelings, but now he knew that only he could be close to her. And perhaps it was for this simple reason that he could not stop smiling and continued to hug the beautiful lady. And most importantly, now Liana could not understand how this nice guy could become a tyrant. Of course, Enoch hasn't yet become a full-fledged tyrant, but he is still the same bloodthirsty guy from the novel who danced with a bloody sword. The lady decided to dot all the I's regarding what had happened before, and asked the young man not to do what he did with his lips anymore. The young man's puzzled face expressed surprise, while the lady assured him that it was all too easy to do. And tenderly pressing himself against her shoulder, the young man could not understand how this girl was going to survive in such a cruel world. In any case, while they were together, no one would dare to think anything bad about them. The lady stroked his head carefully until the young man could not get out of these embraces, despite the fact that they had just arrived. Soon, a solemn day of charity event arrived in the empire, which was celebrated by every resident of the empire. The emperor attended the event with Liana, who looked incredibly cute today in a delicate blue dress. The heroine was always beautiful, and this is no secret. And she knew it was beautiful, even without the emperor's words. She even stated this out loud, and the young man laughed, since it seemed he was the only one who didn't know about this well-known fact. And right now he was actually talking as if he was teasing her, and at that moment voices were heard in the room. It was the elders and the little girl who were seeing the heroes off to a charity event. The baby called them Mom and Dad again, even though Liana had previously warned Ariel not to do that again. The emperor asked the girl to just leave her alone and let her say whatever she wanted. But Liana was afraid that maybe someone would hear and misunderstand. The heroes looked like a happy family, but the heroine did not need more unnecessary rumors, and she was worried. Seeing Liana's serious face, the little girl stared at him, and it seemed as if she was ready to burst into tears the next moment. The little girl was scared and asked if she had done something wrong, afraid that she might be scolded. After stroking the baby's head, the lady declared that she had no intention of scolding her at all, and that she had never done so in her life. Indeed, Ari was simply a wonderful child, and Liana called her the most beautiful girl in the world. The elders were worried about whether the heroes would be able to cope with their tasks, while Liana was worried about whether the elders would be able to cope with Ariel. One of them admitted that this was not the first time they had encountered children, and the lady need not worry about the little one having a wonderful time. Since the baby wasn't officially recognized by the ducal family, she couldn't take Ariel to the official event, so she had to ask the elders to look after the girl. The lady was about to turn to the mansion's servants, but the elders were only too happy to stay with the baby, admitting that at their age, crowded places were already tiring. Things were incredibly calm before the event, and the heroine felt just great before going out. She asked the little girl to promise that she would not cause too much trouble to the elders. And after her words, the girl made such a serious face that, looking into her small eyes, one could really believe it. The lady was sure that the little girl would cope perfectly well without her, but she still approached her again and asked. She asked her to behave well and carefully tied beautiful bandanas on her pink dress. The emperor approached the lady and informed her that a carriage was already waiting for them, and the girl had just finished saying goodbye to Ariel. But today she saw before her a new emperor, in an official suit that was incredibly luxurious. At first, the young man did not understand what was the matter, because she opened her eyes in surprise and stared at his clothes. He awkwardly adjusted the amulet on the imperial robe and asked if something was wrong. Liana immediately noticed Enoch's changed appearance. His hair was styled completely differently, but still looked quite neat. But as soon as Liana left the palace, she saw that the window was not tightly closed, and she decided to go back to call the servants. The event was about to begin, and the heroes had absolutely no time for extraneous matters. The heroine walked back into the estate and saw little Ariel sitting calmly in the arms of the elders. At that moment they noticed something strange, and realized that the emperor definitely could not appear before the guests in such a form. And if he shows up with disheveled, unstyled hair, it will definitely cause some ridiculous rumors. Liana decided to take matters into her own hands and asked the emperor for permission to slightly tweak his appearance. She carefully adjusted the amulet and wondered what it had done to suddenly become so disheveled. Other guests were also slowly arriving at the imperial palace, and one of them, in a snow-white carriage, was Prince Karhel. His bright red suit, emerald brooch, and huge bow on his neck betrayed his aristocratic manners. The assistant noted that the prince was in an incredibly good mood today, and even for him it was obvious. The prince was truly incredibly happy because he had not experienced such feelings in his life for a long time. This was probably due to the fact that he had not visited the empire for so long and was simply in a slightly pleasant anticipation. Karhel, the second prince of the kingdom of Gamel, was especially excited about his appearance. The young man had visited the empire when he was very little and had never imagined that his return would take so long. His anticipation was equal to the time he spent in long waiting before meeting the inhabitants of the empire. The assistant warned that the prince should be careful in relation to His Majesty the Emperor. Unlike the previous emperor, there are rumors that the current emperor has a very eccentric character and should be treated differently. Hearing the words about eccentricity, the young man involuntarily laughed, and he kept forgetting that His Majesty had become an emperor. Be that as it may, the assistant warned not to touch the emperor under any circumstances, and rumors are circulating that anyone who dared to do such a thing was permanently eliminated. Therefore, he was worried that everything would be fine with the prince, and he would not disobey the rules under any circumstances. The assistant warned that if the first prince learned that Karhel had come to the empire, there might be talk. He was really worried that this could affect the prince's family's reputation. Karhel simply asked the young man not to worry and stated that this time everything would definitely work out. Everything will work out on one condition if his assistant keeps his mouth shut and doesn't tell anyone about anything. Of course, his assistant was ready to fulfill any request of the prince, and promised that everything would certainly be exactly that way. The carriage approached the imperial father, and the prince noticed that the blue color of the dome was incredibly beautiful. A charity celebration was taking place in the luxurious imperial garden, with crystal chandeliers reflecting the sunlight, making the jewels sparkle even more brightly. Amidst this gallant bustle, ladies dressed in silks and velvets were excitedly discussing the arrival of a new guest. All the guests' attention was drawn to the appearance of His Majesty the Emperor and the young Viscountess who accompanied him. The Emperor noticed that the girl's face was flushed, as if she was not feeling well, although it was not too hot today. Liana admitted that she was fine, and if the Emperor would be pleased to return her beautiful fan to her. But for some reason the young man insisted that the fan was too heavy, and if the girl held it constantly, she could injure her wrist. The heroine was not as weak as she seemed, but the Emperor was still worried about her condition. He touched her face with his hand in front of everyone, and the guests noticed that His Majesty was fanning the girl with such tender words. He had never paid attention to women before, and there were even rumors that he would be alone all his life, but no one could have imagined that the Emperor could be so affectionate. Embarrassed, Liana took the Emperor's hand and asked him to behave more modestly, so that no one would think anything unnecessary. She was incredibly shy because an incredible number of guests were looking at them while the Emperor carefully fanned her. Enoch didn't even immediately understand what was going on, but Liana warned him that everyone was looking at them. But the Emperor was absolutely indifferent to the empty and absurd rumors that might circulate after their appearance. Even though the Emperor had to maintain dignity, he still decided to do as his heart dictated. Liana admitted that she was fine and asked the young man to hurry up and take care of his duties so that his reputation would not be damaged. Enoch was still standing nearby and wanted to know if the girl would really continue to call him that way throughout the entire celebration. He was a majestic emperor, but all the guests saw that the girl was speaking to him too casually. She even apologized if she had been rude and decided to ask for forgiveness to avoid misunderstandings. The young man was still standing opposite her, and he leaned even closer to her sweet, gentle face. With the question of whether he really has to explain everything, and he doesn't care at all what they think of him now. Liana certainly didn't expect the Emperor to treat her so tenderly in front of many aristocrats. Looking into his eyes, she noticed that the young man had always been dazzlingly handsome, but now he seemed incredibly sweet. Perhaps because the Emperor was in full dress, and today he looked even more magnificent. The Emperor once again warned the lady not to call him by his title under any circumstances, but simply by his first name. It was an official event, and Liana still couldn't allow herself to call His Majesty that. But now the Emperor didn't care at all, and he admitted that lovers can call each other by their first names. Even though they weren't a real couple, he asked the girl not to call him by his title anymore. They stood in the very center, surrounded by a multitude of guests who were closely watching the Emperor's behavior. The heroine understood perfectly well that they were now in an unusual situation, and this certainly could not continue forever. When the ice melts and the Emperor can return to normal life, they will no longer be in love. The play will be over. This means that in order for everything to go as it should, they need to be very, very careful, especially in the presence of other aristocrats. They were still standing there looking at each other, but at that moment Liana felt a strange chill run down her spine. The Emperor's expression instantly changed, and the girl had no idea what could have happened in that second. But now his sweet face was replaced by a cold-blooded grimace, and everything around seemed to be covered in eternal ice. It was the first time the heroine had seen the Emperor suddenly become angry, and it was immediately clear from his facial expressions. Panic gripped the girl. She called Nirvana, asked him to give birth, and asked if everything was okay with him. He held a fan in his hand, which cracked and broke in a second, and the girl was worried that the Emperor might get hurt. The young man only uttered one word, asking for his name, while Liana was completely beside herself. Now he just wanted the girl to call him by his name again, and he declared that only in that case he would let her go. At times the young man really did behave strangely, and probably did not realize how this might look from her side. She called him by name and asked if he could now open his hand, in which lay the broken fan. The Emperor now looked like a little boy who, for the first time in his life, was offended or angry about something. The fan broke into many tiny pieces, and Liana couldn't understand if he was really offended because she simply didn't call him by his name. Luckily, thanks to the glove, his hand was not damaged, but after that, wooden splinters could easily get into his hand. At that moment, a man approached the heroes who had been looking for the Emperor for a long time and longed to meet him. The young man, holding a glass in his hand, introduced himself as Karhel, the second prince of the kingdom of Gamel, and said that it was a great honor for him to meet the Emperor. He had an incredibly gentle, handsome face that was easy to remember, but Liana saw him for the first time, and yet his face seemed familiar to her. The Emperor stated that he did not understand why Prince Hamel might be looking for him, but the young man had already heard about His Majesty. They shook hands, and after all, the kingdom's empires had long maintained important trade relations. The prince decided to ask the Emperor for further patronage for his future trade in mana crystals. In fact, the young man sincerely wanted to meet the Emperor to personally express his respect. Quite by accident, the next second he tripped, and the contents of the glass splashed in all directions. The splashes reached the Emperor, and the prince understood perfectly well that now the Emperor could be met with furious anger. It turned out that through carelessness, he spilled everything on the Emperor's glove, and no one could have expected this. The prince was frightened and so excited that he made a mistake, so now he deeply regretted what happened. Prince Hamel merely spilled his drink, and the Emperor admitted that it was a complete trifle. Just in case, he even took spare gloves with him and stated that absolutely nothing terrible had happened. There were terrible rumors about Enoch, and everyone was sure that the prince would now face wrathful punishment. Enoch tried to find his gloves in his pocket, but apparently forgot because he relaxed and thought that he was in no danger at all. Karhel felt terribly uncomfortable and said that the Emperor had prepared a special gift for him. Behind him stood an assistant, who, with his eyes downcast, held a blue velvet box in his hands. But the Emperor turned around and declared that he would be ready to accept the gift later, when he had free time. Karhel assured that this gift was prepared with the deepest sincerity, and he would very much like the Emperor to accept it. He bowed his head before him, and had no intention of darkening the celebration on this joyful day of charitable celebration. Karhel looked respectfully into the eyes of the Emperor and asked if he could ask him to moderate his anger and graciously accept his gift. Behind the Emperor's back, the guests whispered that the prince's actions were too abrupt even for the Emperor. It was known to everyone that the Empire had a huge number of contracts with the Kingdom of Gamel. Therefore, the Emperor had no choice but to gratefully agree to the prince's terms. The luxurious box contained black leather gloves with gold embroidery, adorned with first-class mana stones mined only this season. Karhel prepared them because he had heard that His Majesty always wore gloves, and was glad that he was the one who was able to bring them to the event. The Emperor was interested in his gift because these gloves were unusual. Liana immediately noticed that the stone that was sewn onto them looked like that bright blood-red ruby. Enoch moved closer to the prince to take a closer look at the stone on the gloves. Liana quickly realized that something was wrong and shouted loudly that the emperor should not wear them under any circumstances. She saw Enoch's frightened face, which probably didn't even suspect that something strange could be happening here. The girl looked at the emperor with concern and tried to make him understand that this could indeed be very dangerous. Karhel, in turn, pretended that he didn't understand anything at all and only wanted to present the emperor with a gift. But the next second, a malicious smile appeared on his face, and he asked what was going on here. Liana approached the box and declared that the emperor should not put on these gloves until Enoch understood what was going on. Now she understood where the strange feeling of déjà vu that had accompanied her from the very beginning of the event had come from. There was an episode in the novel where the emperor, having put on these gloves, went berserk in front of everyone, and the story was told from Elisha's point of view, so it is understandable that Liana knew absolutely nothing about it. She was absolutely certain that these gloves were the cause of the rampage, but it had to happen after Enoch's return. But for some reason it was happening right now. She didn't even notice how she began to bite her lips out of nerves, and Enoch carefully approached her and asked her to calm down. He didn't understand why Liana suddenly became so serious and worried, because these were just ordinary gloves. Karhel asked if the emperor had any problems and was not ready to accept the gift from him. The emperor warned that everything was in order and was going to accept these gloves with gratitude. Standing behind the young man, the girl did not understand what to do because she could not allow him to put them on right now. She didn't know anything else, no detailed information, but the next second she felt very bad. Liana winced in pain. The emperor rushed to her aid and could not understand what had happened. The girl understood perfectly well that her reputation was hopelessly ruined the moment the emperor rejected the gift. She picked up a glass of alcohol and began to drink it greedily, and all this time she did not say a word. The emperor silently looked at the lady's strange behavior, and all the guests were also a little stunned. And since it had come to this, the heroine had no other choice but to use the image of the real Liana to her advantage. And if trouble arose, the heroine decided to have the emperor simply blame everything on her. She quietly asked if he could put the gloves on later, confessing that her feet hurt terribly and she could no longer stand in one place. After drinking a glass of wine in one gulp, Liana pretended to be drunk and asked the emperor to take her to another place. This was the only option that could distract the emperor from the gift, and she asked to do it as soon as possible. She believed that he would respond to her request with lightning speed, and the next second she felt his strong arms. Right before everyone's eyes, the girl found herself in the emperor's arms, and he deftly picked her up like a feather. Liana asked what the emperor was doing, but she had just said that her legs hurt and she was unable to walk. The heroine did not at all expect that the emperor would carry her in this way. She was sure that it would have been enough to simply walk with her. Turning to the prince, the young man declared that his precious beloved was bored, and it seemed he would not be able to try on the gift right away. Smiling a false smile, the prince admitted that, of course, he understood everything perfectly. Liana asked to be taken to a safe place, and closing the curtains from the guests, urgently asked to see his hand. She was worried that the emperor might feel cold or something like that, since he had just touched her. The girl was excited, and the young man asked her to speak more slowly, promising that he would definitely not go anywhere. To begin with, they decided to sit down and just catch their breath, and the heroine told the speech about the gloves of Prince Gamel's move. There was indeed something wrong with them, and the emperor realized that her sudden embrace was just an attempt to prevent him from putting on those gloves. Liana apologized. She was in a hurry and couldn't just say not to wear them without a good reason, so she decided to do just that. She put the emperor in an awkward position by creating such a scene, and even tears of despair appeared in her eyes. But she didn't want the young man to see her crying, and simply stated that she decided to sneeze. In any case, the heroine was incredibly worried that she could tarnish His Majesty's reputation. Liana was supposed to play the role of the lover, but instead she behaved childishly in front of all the aristocrats, and she understood that problems could arise because of today's incident. She promised to take full responsibility and fix everything, but the young man did not want the lady to put herself in danger. I think he already said this, that he did not have the kind of reputation that could be so easily tarnished. However, this does not mean that the emperor is so powerless as to hide behind the back of a fragile girl. After all, he was a majestic ruler, and he asked if she seriously believed that he would not be able to cope with such a situation. Enoch acted very confidently, and the lady realized that all this time she had really been worrying in vain. Now she just had to tell why these gloves couldn't be worn and why a strong spell had been cast on them. Liana admitted that once the emperor puts on these gloves, his power will instantly go out of control. She couldn't discuss it in front of strangers, so she had to make a ridiculous, childish scene. And as a quick solution, she created a stupid situation so that no one present would understand anything. The emperor asked how exactly the girl managed to find out that a terrible spell had been placed on the gloves. The gift from the prince looked completely ordinary, and Enoch didn't even suspect that there could be anything wrong with them. Now he learned the terrible truth, which all this time he had not even suspected, that something was happening behind his back. They were talking about a mysterious curse, but the heroine couldn't admit that she was a time traveler who learned about it from a book. At that very moment, she had to somehow explain how she knew that the gloves had a terrible curse on them. The emperor once again asked how the girl knew that there was something strange about these gloves. He couldn't even believe that this was a real reality that happened right at a charity event. On the outside, the gloves looked quite ordinary, with an exquisite leather texture and a huge ruby stone in the center. He suggested that it was okay, and if it was difficult for the girl to explain it, he would examine them himself. Liana asked if the emperor wasn't interested in knowing where she got all this information from, but Enoch responded with a categorical refusal, because he saw that it was very difficult for the lady to talk about this. And from the girl's agitated behavior, he realized that she did not want to discuss it, and he was not going to insist. Liana was the only one who knew something that no one else knew, and that in itself was truly incredibly strange. Looking at the emperor with fear, the girl waited to see what he would do next. But the young man felt and believed that the girl would never harm him, and he was ready to deal with the problem himself. She lowered her head and sadly asked why he trusted people so easily, since many wished him harm. After all, if something arouses suspicion, the first thing to do is to doubt it and, first of all, to conduct an interrogation. If His Highness continues to mindlessly trust someone who tells him nothing, he may have big problems in the future. In response to her words, Enoch could only smile involuntarily while she said that one cannot trust people so easily. She even stated that no matter what she does, he doesn't even know if she has any secret, evil intentions. In the depths of his heart, the emperor felt that Liana could not harm him, and he gently touched her hand. He asked if she had such intentions, although he knew perfectly well that this was definitely not the case. And he tenderly asked if she really planned to wring his neck with those graceful, fragile hands. Liana was a little taken aback by these words and stated that she never even thought of harming him and only wished him well. For some reason, the emperor sincerely trusted her and knew that she was exactly like that and would never harm him. And for the lady's information, he admitted that he doesn't trust people that easily, and she was the first girl he treated that way. Enoch said confidently. He trusted only her, and there was no talk of any other people. The heroine didn't understand how he could say embarrassing things so calmly, but the emperor suggested that they first find out what kind of gloves these were. He was ready to listen to Liana when she was ready to share the information that she was so carefully hiding. The heroine agreed to all his conditions, and for some reason, a dark blue magical portal suddenly appeared in front of the emperor. The young man didn't want the two to meet again, but he opened the magical portal for a reason. The next second, he pulled the master of the magic tower out of the magic portal by the hair, who had not expected such a sudden call. Arun appeared before the hero and stated that what was happening here was because he had not received any notifications. And Liana didn't expect to see here the master of the magic tower, who had recently bitten her on the neck. He assumed that this gentleman could tell him information about the gloves, and he remembered very well that he and Liana had crossed paths quite recently. Arun was outraged by this behavior and did not understand why he was called so urgently. The young man was caught right in the middle of a meal, and Liana asked him to cover his mouth so as not to see the pieces of chewed food. The master of the magic tower was displeased, because one way or another even dogs are not touched during mealtimes, and he was unexpectedly dragged here. The emperor lightly hit him on the head and asked him to apologize first, but the master was sure that His Majesty was constantly picking on him. He warned that if he refused, the agreement about the magic tower would be nullified, so Arun immediately understood his menacing intentions. There was nothing to do. He apologized to the girl for that bite on the neck and admitted that at such moments his mind simply switches off. The master of the magic tower promised never to do that again as soon as he remembered how he got it from the emperor for just one bite. The emperor smiled and asked Arun not to continue his stupid speeches anymore, although his bruises still hadn't gone away from the last time. The two were acting like real children, and the lady decided to intervene, saying that she was curious about something. She noticed that the characters seemed very close and that they were definitely connected by some kind of business relationship. The master of the magic tower said that this was absolutely not true, but the heroine understood that they had definitely known each other for a very long time. Arun did not address the emperor formally, and that is why the lady thought that there might be some kind of friendship between them. The emperor stated that this was because the gentleman was not at all familiar with human etiquette, and no matter how many times he told him, he did not even think of learning it. It was a matter of human etiquette, but the master of the magic tower was a magical being who found it very difficult. Arun was a fox beastman, and his animal instincts were stronger than human ones, so he could be extremely rude. The heroine did not remember anything similar being mentioned in the novel about the fox. The master of the magic tower looked like a man, but in essence he was an animal. Overjoyed, the young man even offered to show his true appearance, but to be honest, the emperor wasn't particularly interested. The next second, the master of the magic tower, Arun, turned into a snow-white magical fox. The transformation was instantaneous and complete, leaving no trace of the stardust-strewn robe. Arun, already in the form of a fox, gracefully stepped with his paw onto the marble floor, leaving a barely noticeable shimmering trace on it. Only his fluffy, sparkling white fur, piercing scarlet eyes, and an aura of unearthly power revealed him as the former ruler of these lands. Scarlet eyes, piercing and wise, burned with an inner light, reflecting endless knowledge and incomprehensible power. The master of the magic tower knew that he looked dazzling, but according to the heroine, the novel mentioned that he looked like an ordinary mongrel. Usually the young man did not show his true form to just anyone. The fox Arun was the embodiment of silent grace, mortal danger, and mysterious beauty. Arun admitted that since the girl was dear to the emperor, he made an exception for her today. Now that he was in his fox form, he could feel it much more clearly, and the girl really did smell delicious. Arun admitted that for some reason he hadn't noticed him at all before, and there were probably reasons for that. The fox wondered if the lady had ever lent her power to anyone, but that was impossible. And if power of that magnitude were to be given to another, that person would become intoxicated with temptation and lose their mind forever. Liana stated that she had not borrowed any powers and had no idea what the magical fox was talking about. The emperor threw the gauntlet at the magical animal because the fox did not respond to the girl's requests to move away from her. Enoch once again warned the master of the magic tower to get off the lady with his paws and never do anything like that again. Liana understood everything perfectly, but seeing how the emperor threw down the gauntlet, she asked whether it was possible to allow him to be tormented like that. The glove appeared in the magical fox's mouth with lightning speed, and he began to crunch it like a tasty bone. The emperor was confident that it was up to the recipient of the gift to decide how to use it, and he did not oppose the master of the magic tower. Suddenly, Liana saw an icy gaze, almost like that of the Tyrant emperor from the novel. The fox finished chewing on the glove and stated that it must have been difficult to obtain a mana stone of such high quality. The emperor said that it was a gift from the prince of the kingdom as a sign of friendship and asked if there was anything strange about it. It's no surprise, this stone was mined from their region, and the fox initially even assumed that there was nothing unusual about it. Except for one thing, the glove had an incredibly disgusting smell stuck to it that couldn't be confused with anything else. Immediately after the presentation of the gift, the prince tried to hide from the sight of those present in order to think about what was happening. What he was most afraid of was that this time he really was almost caught, because he was keeping too many secrets. The young man thought that after several years he would finally see something interesting that would stir his cold feelings. And he had definitely arrived at the charity event for a reason, and now he was surprised how the girl had managed to find out something. The young man cast a perfect spell, so perfect that the emperor would not even notice the trick. Yes, Lady Harrington mentioned that her sister had become strange lately, and she seemed somehow different, not at all like before. Undoubtedly, the young man himself was convinced that Liana Daphne had changed very much, and a completely different aura emanated from her. The one who had one foot in the grave earlier not only came back to life, but also got involved in the emperor's very curious affairs. The young man assumed that with time he would be able to find out the reason for her sudden change, but for now other matters awaited him. After all, he had plenty of time, because the prince was not at all what he claimed to be. A few days later, after a minor commotion, the heroes arrived at the banquet hall again, and this time Liana clearly realized that the prince was making her feel uneasy. She sat quietly behind the bushes and watched Karhel's behavior. At that moment, the emperor approached her, closing his eyes. He asked who the girl was watching so intently, and she was definitely not just sitting in the bushes. He realized that she seemed to be watching the prince, but she did not have any evil intentions. Liana was simply sure that something was wrong with this glove. To be honest, she couldn't trust this man at all. Having apologized for burdening the emperor with unverified information, the lady still decided to check something. Moreover, the master of the magic tower did not agree to examine the glove in more detail, and this was certainly not without reason. The emperor asked, "The lady is always full of energy, running around everywhere, but for some reason now she was completely upset over such a trifle." The emperor did not particularly like this Prince Karhel, and he felt it too. He managed to find out that the crown prince was originally supposed to be the head of the delegation, but the kingdom's delegation was instead headed by Prince Karhel. As it turned out, they not only suddenly changed the head of the delegation, but also installed a completely different person as ruler. It turned out to be the second prince, the one who had never shown himself in public, and this was rather strange. In theory, they should have chosen a man who often appeared in social circles and was involved in public activities, but the prince was not like that. It was at least strange to hear this, although from the very beginning the heroine seemed extremely suspicious. Therefore, the emperor was confident that the girl's suspicions towards him were probably not unfounded. Since he thought exactly the same, it was not without reason that he was appointed ruler, and there is clearly some mystery hidden here. To ease the tension and the situation a little, the emperor picked up a tiny flower leaf. He carefully inserted it into the heroine's hair and admitted that she was incredibly beautiful, and this small, cute flower suited her very well. Liana was frightened by such closeness and asked them to move away from each other, but Enoch asked why they should do that. She couldn't explain much, but she tried her best to follow the plot of the novel so as not to spoil anything. But at this time the guests continued to stare at them, and it seemed that there were more and more people. In any case, they would despise the heroine for the trouble she caused, but the emperor asked the girl not to worry about it anymore. The human brain is simpler than it seems. It tends to remember only the most sensational things. During this time, the heroes became much closer, and Liana did not quite understand what the emperor's words meant. He meant that in the perception of those people, neither the fact that the prince presented the gift, nor the fact that she intercepted it, would definitely not remain in the memory in the future. Soon people will forget everything, none of this will be remembered, and there is no point in worrying about trifles. Instead, the emperor, enchanted by his beautiful companion, simply threw away the gift. And he disappeared, hugging his beloved, and this will become that very main, long-awaited topic of discussion. The emperor laughed, for he had already been given a new nickname, the Fool in Love, because he had indeed behaved strangely then. However, he believed that this was the best nickname and the funniest of those he had heard, and it certainly could not destroy the entire empire and his authority. In fact, Liana felt sorry and thought that, at worst, rumors would spread criticizing her for the problems she had caused. Most of all, she was surprised who came up with such a nickname, and she was pleased that the young man was not at all angry with her. Enoch continued to laugh while the heroine was indignant at who dared to call His Majesty the Emperor a fool in love. He looked into her eyes with special care and asked her to put aside all her worries. And in fact, people's reaction was not as bad as the girl imagined. Looking at the guests, she really saw that none of them were looking at her inappropriately, and the atmosphere was favorable. The emperor admitted that the guests' behavior was entirely her fault, although Liana didn't understand what she had to do with it. The attitude towards the emperor had changed. It wasn't the same as when he would throw a fit if anyone touched him, so the nickname Fool in Love is much more appropriate and endearing. Wanting to know the girl's opinion, the emperor carefully asked what she thought about this matter. Liana noticed, but lately he seemed incredibly calm and happy, and she was glad that her actions hadn't caused him any problems. In the long run, they are doomed to become strangers to each other, but now the heroine wonders if all this is right. If the heroes continue to foster false relationships for those around them, then perhaps everything can change. The void in Enoch's life that will be left by her disappearance is the void that will be left in her life without the emperor. And perhaps if we reach such a scale, then there will definitely be no turning back, and in the future, this could create a lot of problems. Liana spoke about her experiences, but the emperor did not understand what problems might arise. After all, if it comes to this, the lives of both heroes can change for the better and more pleasant. Looking into his sincere eyes, the girl understood that the connection between them was growing stronger every day. The lady was unable to cope with her raging emotions and found only one way out that could calm her down. With a wave of her white dress, she admitted that she wanted to go away and just get some fresh air. She left without answering, and the emperor looked after her sadly, calling the girl by name. Unfortunately, the young man could not understand why this fragile and strange lady behaved this way, as if sooner or later she would have to disappear one day, without a trace, irrevocably and forever. The heroine went to a secluded place so that the emperor would not see her. Tears of despair appeared in her eyes. She did not understand why His Majesty always spoke like that, and much of what he said was incomprehensible to her. True, the emperor always chose words that caused misunderstanding, and each time he said incredibly serious things so casually. In that conversation, he suggested simply becoming an empress, but if she did not want to be an empress, she could even become a great emperor. Liana was worried that anyone who could hear his speech would think that he really liked her incredibly. The heroine didn't even notice how she said it out loud, and Enoch was simply kind by nature, and she didn't imagine too much. The girl firmly decided to pull herself together, and she was sure that the young man would consider her ridiculous if he now found out about her stupid thoughts. She stood up from the table and felt a sharp pain on her leg, on which a red callus was visible, but she needed to follow Karhel to find out the truth. Applying a white handkerchief to the wound, the heroine suddenly heard that someone understood that they were definitely talking about him. Recognizing this voice, she immediately understood everything, and the prince passed by, heard his name, and decided to come over, so they met again. The young man stated that the heroine had been hanging around him all the time in recent days, and he was absolutely sure of it. Liana replied that he had misunderstood everything, and that their paths had simply crossed by chance, but the prince definitely did not agree with her opinion. He saw drops of blood running down the girl's leg and decided to examine the wound, asking if she had really been interested in him all this time. After the charity banquet, Karhel thought about Liana for a long time, and he also wanted to find out something about her. For some reason, this man now looked charming and sweet, but Liana understood that under no circumstances should she fall for these tricks. The prince examined her leg to make sure the wound was not serious, while Liana watched silently as the stranger touched her leg. He accidentally pressed directly on the swollen wound, and Liana involuntarily even cried out in pain. She felt it was too impolite to touch anyone without permission, even though her leg was very swollen. Having firmly expressed her intention for the prince to immediately remove his hands, the heroine felt very strong pain. She admitted that whatever the condition of her leg, it shouldn't worry Karhel, or he doesn't know that one-sided contact can be unpleasant. The young man laughed and said, "Just think, the lady herself followed him with such legs and was probably attracted to him." He still hadn't let go of her leg, while Liana tried her best to pull it away and had already ordered him to let go several times. But suddenly she felt something strange, as if a powerful energy began to hover right around the prince, and for some reason he asked the girl not to move anymore. At this moment, the heroine was really very scared, because she did not understand what was happening. She felt only an unpleasant sensation, as if all the strength was suddenly leaving her body, and this was very unpleasant. Not understanding why this was happening, Liana even thought that perhaps the alcohol she had drunk earlier was only now starting to take effect. The prince leaned closer and closer to her face, and suddenly he suggested talking about how the girl managed to learn the terrible secret. Liana was so dizzy and didn't want to talk at all, so she pushed him away and carried him away, asking him never to do that again. She was definitely not ready to sit quietly like a doll and tolerate everything that the gentleman allowed himself to do and say. Finally, after a couple of seconds, she was able to breathe freely again and asked why the prince dared to brazenly lean right up to her face. The stunned young man asked why the lady was reacting like that and if there was something wrong with his face. Although the prince was handsome to Liana's eyes, who was accustomed to seeing the emperor every day, he was like an empty space. She asked him to let go of her leg again and declared that she could no longer stand such rudeness. The prince smiled and asked the girl to answer, promising that only in this case would he remove his hands. It was all too tiring, and the heroine didn't care at all whether it was the prince or anyone else in front of her, so she said, "Did he really need to explain the reason?" The girl asked him to stop and leave, but unfortunately the prince did not even suspect that the emperor was heading straight towards him. He finally let go of her leg and said that if the lady was interested in anything about him, she should feel free to come by any time. And it seems he decided to stay here for a long time to find out what secrets the stranger is hiding. Liana glared menacingly at the prince and said nothing in response, but she knew perfectly well that something like this would definitely not happen anytime soon. She went with the emperor and told him that the prince was rather strange and was behaving inappropriately. Before this, Liana had decided to run here barefoot, but she was so happy that she even forgot to put on the shoes she had taken with her. The emperor found her behavior funny and sweet, and the girl walked barefoot on the grass, holding her shoes in her hands. Suddenly, she felt the touch of a man's hand on her waist, and in a second she blushed like a bright, ripe cherry. The emperor asked the lady to stand with their feet on his shoes and offered to go inside straight away. It was a child's game, and Liana hadn't done it for a long time, but she had done it often as a child. Enoch asked who she was doing this to, whether it was the Marquis Daphne, who was rumored to be an incredibly gloomy man. In fact, the heroine didn't even really remember her parents from the previous world, and asked if they would really continue to go on like this. She was worried that she might step on her expensive shoes, but the emperor didn't care at all at that moment. He asked why that scoundrel Karhel was next to her at the moment he approached, and she was sitting completely alone before that. Enoch began to worry. Perhaps the prince could say something to the girl, or, even worse, do something. Liana said that the prince did nothing of the sort, but he knew that she had been stalking him for several days. She was sure that she had been hiding very well all this time, and no one should have noticed her, especially the prince himself. She also admitted that the young man asked if the young lady was interested in him and tried to find out why she was following him. She didn't keep it a secret. The prince openly admitted that he was interested in her, and the emperor didn't like it very much. In addition, he touched her leg without permission, but Liana warned him. She tried in every possible way to fight him off. The emperor had to struggle to contain the curses that were pouring out in a torrent. Besides, the prince said that he would most likely stay here for a long time, and Liana could drop in to see him at a convenient time. What worried the heroine most was that Karhel came so close to her, and it was all disgusting. If it weren't for the contract, she would have pulled out all his hair. Suddenly, the girl heard a strange crunch, and realized that at that moment the emperor clenched his fist so hard that something inside crumbled. Enoch's expression changed instantly, and now he wanted to know what else that scoundrel had dared to say. The prince said nothing more, and just as the heroine realized, the emperor crushed the stone with his bare hand. This couldn't have happened just like that. The girl understood that something in her words probably angered the emperor. Fearing that she might have said something wrong, the lady fell silent as the young man continued to kneel before her and remain silent. In the palace, the maids were busy with the banquet, and suddenly a female voice was heard in the huge hall asking the emperor to let them go. Enoch carried the girl in his arms because all her feet were covered in abrasions and her leg was very swollen. He tried to be considerate and asked the lady to just stay in his arms and not resist the topic because he would not let her go anyway. The heroine assumed that perhaps she had indeed made a mistake, but she didn't even know what she had said wrong. What she was most afraid of was that one of the servants would see what was happening and again think that Enoch was just a stupid emperor in love. Right now he was forcing the girl to act in such a way that all the courtiers of the palace could see exactly this. The emperor was confident that this would make it perfectly clear to everyone who was closest to him. That frightening, cold-blooded look appeared on his face again, but the sweet smile suited the young man best. Right now, the emperor was about to take the girl to the bathroom, but at first she was incredibly happy when she thought about hot water. The very next second, the heroine experienced an awkward misunderstanding because it was unclear why the emperor was carrying her there. She screamed at the whole palace why the emperor decided to bring her to the bath because it was too strange a place to spend time together. It turned out to be much simpler, and he just wanted to wash the dirty wound on his leg to avoid infection. At this moment, the young man looked very concerned, and every second he asked how much the swollen wound hurt. He even warned that he would be extremely careful and asked the lady to be patient for a little while to wash the wound. So, the young man brought her to the bathroom to treat the wound, and Liana kept telling herself not to give in to illusions, and it was strange to her that the emperor himself was washing her feet. Suddenly, she said out loud that even the goldfish had a much better memory than hers, and her words sounded strange. Enoch looked at the lady and asked what she meant, while she denied that she had said anything serious. The young man warned that next time he would definitely tell the servant to prepare more comfortable shoes without heels so that she would not get such terrible blisters again. Carefully washing the wound, the young man admitted that she was always beautiful and radiant, even without heels. His words were true, and the heroine wondered how someone could say such a thing without even thinking. She felt herself becoming more and more embarrassed with each passing second, and asked the young man to stop saying such sweet words. Enoch's peculiarity was that he was completely incapable of lying and always spoke the truth to the face. There was a warm, pleasant conversation between them, and having relaxed a little, Liana asked if he really wasn't angry with her. Enoch was truly not angry at anything. He was in his right mind, not understanding why he should be angry at her. For some reason, the heroine felt that the Emperor would be angry with her behavior, but he never even said a rude word to her. Even though something similar happened in the carriage when she was trying to find out if he was feeling unwell, so she decided to clarify the situation, whether the Emperor was upset because the prince touched her leg. Because in the carriage, she promised that no one would ever touch her again, but this time, she really didn't touch him. The Emperor carefully treated the wound, and last time his soul was truly blazing with jealousy. And now she understood why Enoch was unhappy, and it was worth mentioning that Karhel touched her leg. But she confidently stated that this time she did not touch anyone at all, and it was the prince who touched her without asking. Enoch understood perfectly well that the lady was indifferent this time, and she could do nothing in this situation. Still, just thinking about it made him feel bad, and he didn't like it at all. Lightly touching her leg, Enoch asked if she remembered what she had said to him in the carriage that day and what promise she had made. Then the young man confessed that Liana was the only one for him, the one he could touch and feel something pleasant. And now the young man was sure that he wanted to become such a person for Liana, and he sincerely admitted it. His strong masculine hands touched her leg, and the Emperor admitted that he incredibly enjoyed touching her and simply staying close. Noticing such little things, for example, what a girl wants to do, or what she wants to eat. And these happy little things were quite enough for him. He touched her knee with his cheek, looking into her eyes, and sincerely said that he would like to be that first one, and the only one, in everything, in every second of life, in every day that touches only her delicate skin. Enoch asked not to allow anyone else to be near him, and the moment he saw her and the prince, angry feelings raged within him. It was indeed extremely dangerous, and the young man just wanted the girl to always stay by his side. In the carriage, she promised that he would be the only one who could touch her, and at that moment, Liana noticed that the young man's voice was trembling, but he was only touching her leg. The girl's heart pounded wildly in her chest, echoing in her ears the Emperor's gaze, so piercing and tender at the same time, penetrated into the deepest hidden corners of her soul. Stepping onto the cold marble, Liana felt her cheeks burn. He was the Emperor, and she was just a traveler from a novel, and she had no idea what he saw in her. His concern, so sudden, made her lose her composure. Like a frightened animal, she rushed away from the warmth and comfort, towards the unknown. Suddenly, Liana screamed Ariel's name, dousing the Emperor with water, and the young man certainly did not expect such a turn of events. She rushed to the door, declaring that it was time for her to return to the estate, as the baby would soon be asleep. Liana tried to stop the trembling in her arms and legs, but her heart continued to pound wildly in her chest. She didn't understand why she was reacting this way. Perhaps it was fear of a strong man or an unusual feeling of tenderness that she didn't know how to respond to. Or perhaps it was something more, something dangerous, that made her run to save herself from herself. But the Emperor grabbed her hand, and together they fell into a large bath of water, splashing in all directions, drenching the walls. For a moment, Liana froze, surprised by the unexpected situation, while warm drops of water ran down her face. The water was warm and silky to the touch, and all the hero's clothes were soaking wet. Liana started laughing, unable to stop, either from the awkwardness of the situation, or from the overwhelming relief, or from the sudden feeling of freedom that she had not experienced for a very long time. Drops of water ran down her cheeks, mixing with tears of laughter. Enoch hugged the girl carefully, and no matter what, she definitely wouldn't be able to run away from him now. The world around them seemed to cease to exist, and only the two of them remained in the bathroom, filled with the scent of roses. Liana felt her heart beating faster and faster, anticipating something new and unknown. And holding her wet hair in his hand, the Emperor again asked what her answer would be. His touch was light, almost weightless, but it sent a wave of warmth through Liana's body. She froze, staring into his eyes, and the laughter gradually died down, giving way to something deeper and more complex. Liana assumed she looked like a drowned rat, but it turned out she was cornered. Enoch, sitting in wet clothes, confessed to the girl that she could take her time with her answer. However, he hoped that Liana's answer would be positive, and she would agree to become his companion. After this phrase, the Emperor headed towards the door, while the stunned lady continued to look after him. She thought that he would leave right now, but at that moment a white, soft towel appeared on her head. Carefully wiping her wet head, the young man confessed that the lady had broken her promise, a promise not to touch anyone but him. Liana was perplexed, because Prince Karhel did it on his own initiative, and she didn't even lay a finger on him. The Emperor blocked her path, and on the one hand it was very mean, and on the other hand very sweet, but nothing could be done. And a promise is a promise, and as promised, the girl will still have to fulfill the Emperor's wish. Without even suspecting what desire he was talking about, the lady prepared to listen to him attentively. But after these words, he suddenly fell silent, standing with his bare feet in the warm, pleasant water. He continued to dry her with a towel and said that he would definitely tell her about it, but a little later. Liana asked how grandiose the wish the young man was going to make this time. She had absolutely no money, and she certainly couldn't buy him any expensive gift. But Enoch had always been a little greedy, and this time he was greedy not at all when it came to finances. For Liana, this information remained a mystery, and she could not even imagine what the Emperor would want. After this conversation, they decided to return to the room so that no one would catch a cold at this rate. The Emperor had already found out about little Ariel, and they said she had gone for a walk with the elders and was expected to return soon. He walked into the room and wanted to tell Liana about it, but something incredibly cute appeared before his eyes. The girl in a warm terry robe was sitting on the sofa. Her eyes were closed, and it was obvious she was fast asleep. It was the Emperor's room, and he could not help but be touched, because the lady looked very defenseless, since she didn't even wake up when he came in, but he realized he just needed to put her to bed. Probably after the warm bath, Liana relaxed, and after so many worries, she finally fell into a deep sleep. It seemed she was really sleeping very soundly, and there was nothing to be done, so the young man decided to act. Finally, he was sure that the beautiful lady needed to sleep in comfort, and he gently touched her shoulders. Liana didn't even wake up when the young man picked her up and carefully walked to his bedroom. He laid her on a soft pillow and covered her with a down blanket so that the lady would be warm and comfortable. And he lay down next to her and could not tear himself away from her sweet face, which even in her sleep looked incredibly beautiful. A light touch, like a breath of wind, barely perceptible but leaving a trace of warmth and trepidation on the skin. Enoch kept his gaze fixed on her, as if he were afraid to disturb this moment of peace and quiet. Usually commanding and imperturbable, he now seemed vulnerable, almost defenseless. Something like tenderness flickered in the depths of his dark eyes, a feeling he had suppressed for so long, considering it a weakness. As expected, Liana was cute. Even without fancy shoes, without jewelry, she radiated light. The Emperor understood that this woman, who had fallen asleep in his bed, was capable of changing his life, breaking the boundaries that he had so carefully built around himself. He wondered why Liana always assumed the end. She had already said more than once that when the ice in his heart melted, he would be able to return to normal life. She spoke about the end of the play, that they would no longer be in love, and at the moment they were together only out of necessity. And Enoch was at a loss, and when the play was over they would never see each other again, but he was just beginning to feel something. The reason his heart beat faster when he saw this girl was not just a physical reaction. The young man thought that he was only now beginning to dimly understand the true nature of this feeling, and he could not believe that all this could end. And it hurt him that Liana continued to draw a clear line between them, assuring him that everything would come to an end. He was ready for these changes, and was ready to let love and trust into his life, but many questions tormented his soul. Stroking her soft skin, the young man thought about only one thing: what he was doing now and what was happening to him. At first, it was enough for the Emperor to simply dine with someone else, but with Liana everything was different. It was nice for him to simply hold hands, to feel that warmth with every cell of his frozen soul. And all this time he was quite happy, just enjoying ordinary life, spending time together. They say that human greed knows no bounds, and now the Emperor realized that this was indeed true. And he would like the girl's heart to beat in unison with his, and he dreamed that she would look at him with the same affection with which he looked at her. But for some reason, with each passing day, the greed for sensations continued to grow, and with each passing day, he wanted to spend more and more time with her. Enoch realized he wanted her to see him not as a patient who needed medicine, but as a person, so that she would see in him a real, strong man for whom she would feel weak. And now this girl she was so incredible was just sleeping sweetly in his bed, and he couldn't stop looking at her. Liana muttered something in her sleep. What happened earlier was very unfair. And now that she was close, that he could touch her skin, he was afraid that this dream would end, that she would disappear like the morning fog. He carefully raised himself up on his elbow. Peering into her face, there was only calm, serene, like the mirror-like surface of a lake in the pre-dawn hour. Enoch hugged the girl, and in this silence, he was ready to promise himself that he would do everything to protect her and preserve the world of fragile happiness. He slowly sank down onto the pillow, snuggling closer to her, wanting this moment to just last forever. But he believed that if you want it badly enough, if you put in all the effort, you can reach any star. She was his star, and Enoch felt ready to let go of his principles, ready to fight for her love, ready to give everything just to see the reciprocal feeling of love in her eyes.